What if the world before the flood was not destroyed because humanity became violent, but because humanity stopped being human? My friends, I want you to sit with that question for a moment before we go any deeper. Because almost everything we were taught about Noah's world sounds strangely incomplete. We were told it was a story about wickedness, corruption, violence, moral collapse, and yes, the Bible absolutely says those things. But hidden between the lines of Genesis is something far darker, something ancient writers seemed terrified to describe directly. Because Genesis never says ordinary sin caused God to flood the entire earth. It says something happened to flesh itself, and God saw that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Not some flesh, all flesh. At first, that phrase sounds simple, symbolic even. But the deeper we looked into the oldest surviving texts, the more disturbing the picture became. Ancient Hebrew scholars understood that phrase very differently than modern readers do. The word corruption was not merely spiritual. It carried biological implications, alteration, contamination, genetic defilement. And suddenly the flood no longer looked like a punishment for bad behavior. It looked like a reset. But my friends, this is where everything begins to change. Because if Noah's generation was destroyed for crossing forbidden boundaries between human beings and something else, then we must ask ourselves one horrifying question. What boundaries are being crossed today? Look around carefully. Artificial intelligence replacing human thought, genetic editing tools rewriting DNA, scientists growing human-animal hybrid embryos in laboratories, transhumanist billionaires promising immortality through technology, machines merging with the human nervous system, children growing up unable to distinguish reality from artificial illusion. And over all of it hangs the same phrase Christ warned about in Matthew 24. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Most people hear those words and think Jesus was only talking about violence or moral decay. But what if he was warning us about something much older, something hidden beneath the surface of history itself? Because according to the oldest surviving traditions surrounding the flood, the world before Noah was not primitive at all. It was advanced, terrifyingly advanced. The Book of Enoch claims the Watchers descended from heaven and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, not merely magic, not mythology, knowledge, weapon forging, genetic manipulation, cosmetics, astronomy, sorcery, root cutting, the altering of creation itself. And my friends, the deeper we looked into those ancient descriptions, the more they began to resemble our own civilization. That was the moment the fear truly began. At first, this sounded impossible, but then we found something disturbing. Ancient cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years all preserved the same memory. A time before the flood when gods descended from the sky and changed humanity forever. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki. The Greeks described the Titans. The Hindus wrote of divine beings breeding with mortals. The Egyptians preserved stories of celestial rulers carrying forbidden wisdom. The Mayans warned about sky beings who altered the order of the world. Different names, different languages, but always the same pattern. Heavenly entities, forbidden unions, corrupted bloodlines, a catastrophic judgment, and survivors carrying the memory into the new world. Coincidence, perhaps, but my friends, what terrified us was not the similarities alone. It was what came next, because modern science is beginning to cross those exact same boundaries again, quietly, systematically, and under the banner of progress. CRISPR-Cas9, a name most people hear without fear. But when stripped down to its essence, CRISPR is humanity gaining the power to rewrite the code of life itself. Scientists can now remove genes, insert new ones, alter embryos before birth, change biological destiny. And for the first time since the ancient world, humanity is approaching the ability to redesign creation. Do you understand how dangerous that is? Because once a civilization gains the ability to alter humanity itself, there are no limits anymore, no boundaries, no sacred lines. And that is exactly what Genesis suggests happened before the flood. But that's not the strangest part. The modern world is beginning to sound exactly like the ancient world before judgment fell. The Watchers promised enlightenment. Modern technocrats promise human evolution. The Watchers offered forbidden knowledge. Modern corporations offer enhancement technologies. The Watchers blurred the line between man and something beyond man. Now humanity speaks openly about merging consciousness with machines. And my friends, this is where prophecy becomes terrifying. Because Jesus did not compare the last days to Sodom. He compared them to Noah. Why Noah specifically? Why not simply say evil would increase? Why reference a world associated with hybridization, corruption of flesh, and forbidden unions? Unless that exact pattern was destined to return again. And perhaps it already has. Look carefully at the rise of artificial intelligence. At first it appeared harmless, convenient, even exciting. But now machines generate voices indistinguishable from humans. Faces that never existed. Conversations capable of emotional manipulation. Entire realities fabricated through digital illusion. The line between authentic and artificial is dissolving, and once humanity loses the ability to distinguish truth from imitation, control becomes effortless. But my friends, there is something even darker hidden beneath this technological revolution. Because the pre-flood world was not merely corrupted physically, it was psychologically transformed. Ancient texts repeatedly describe a civilization obsessed with violence, pleasure, excess, and rebellion against divine order. Sound familiar? Today, entire industries profit from addiction. Pornography reshapes the minds of children. Algorithms engineer outrage. Entertainment glorifies chaos. And morality itself has become fluid. The modern world calls this liberation. But what if it is degeneration? What if civilization is not evolving upward, but returning backward, returning to the exact spiritual atmosphere that existed before the flood? And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Because, according to Genesis, Noah was not chosen simply because he was righteous. The Hebrew wording implies something else. Noah was perfect in his generations. The phrase generations can also refer to lineage, bloodline, descent. Ancient rabbis debated this for centuries. Why mention Noah's generations in the middle of a story about corruption of flesh, unless his genetic line remained uncorrupted while the rest of the world changed around him? My friends, I know how insane this sounds in the modern age, but ask yourself honestly, why are governments suddenly obsessed with genetics? Why are corporations investing billions into bioengineering? Why are elites speaking openly about redesigning humanity? Why are scientists experimenting with synthetic embryos? And why does it all sound eerily similar to the ancient warnings preserved before the flood? Because the deeper we looked, the darker it became. There is a reason ancient civilizations feared hybrid beings. The Egyptians painted them. The Assyrians carved them into stone. The Greeks turned them into legends, half man, half beast, part divine, part corrupted. These images were not isolated fantasies. They appeared everywhere, as though humanity was trying desperately to preserve the memory of something real, something catastrophic, and perhaps something returning, because now laboratories around the world openly create chimeras, human-monkey embryos, animal-human hybrids, synthetic life forms. They call it medical advancement. But my friends, that is exactly how forbidden knowledge always enters us. Not as evil, as necessity, as progress, as salvation. And my friends, salvation is exactly what the modern world is searching for right now. Fear is rising, wars increasing, economies trembling, mental illness exploding, loneliness consuming entire generations. Humanity senses something approaching, even if it cannot name it. And into that fear steps technology promising deliverance, immortality through machines, consciousness uploaded into computers, bodies enhanced beyond natural limits, digital gods replacing divine dependence. The same temptation from Eden. You shall become as gods. But my friends, this is only the beginning, because once humanity rejects its created boundaries, something ancient always enters through the cracks. And according to the oldest prophecies, those cracks are opening again right now. My friends, before we go further, I need you to understand something that most people completely miss about the flood narrative. The flood was not only destruction, it was containment. That single realization changes everything. Because when you read Genesis carefully, you begin noticing strange details that theologians often move past too quickly. Details that seem small at first, until they begin connecting into something horrifying. Why were the Nephilim mentioned immediately before the flood? Why does Genesis interrupt the story of Noah to suddenly describe the sons of God taking human women? Why preserve that detail at all, unless it was central to the judgment itself? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why does Genesis say the Nephilim existed in those days, and also afterward? That phrase should terrify every serious reader of prophecy, because it implies the corruption survived. Somehow, somewhere. And my friends, when we follow that thread through ancient history, it leads us into one of the darkest mysteries humanity has ever tried to bury. The bloodline of the giants did not disappear after the flood. It resurfaced again and again. Look at the ancient world after Noah, the Anakim, the Rephim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, King Og of Bashan, whose iron bed measured nearly 14 feet long. Why does the Bible repeatedly mention giant tribes long after the flood if the corruption had supposedly been erased? At first, scholars dismissed these stories as exaggeration, mythology, symbolic language. But then archaeology began uncovering anomalies impossible to ignore. Elongated skulls in Peru with cranial volumes far larger than normal humans. Massive skeletal remains reported throughout the 19th century. Ancient megalithic structures modern engineers still struggle to explain. And this is where things become deeply uncomfortable. Because whenever evidence appears suggesting ancient humanity was not entirely human, the evidence vanishes. Reclassified, mocked, buried beneath ridicule. But why? What are they afraid humanity might discover? Because if hybridization occurred once before, then modern civilization may not be inventing something new. We may be repeating something old, something catastrophic. And my friends, this is where the modern world begins mirroring Noah's generation with terrifying precision. The pre-flood world was obsessed with transcendence, so is ours. Today, Silicon Valley elites openly discuss defeating death, extending consciousness indefinitely, creating superintelligence, escaping biological limitations. Even the language sounds ancient. They no longer speak merely about technology. They speak about becoming post-human, beyond humanity. And if that phrase does not send chills down your spine after everything we have uncovered, then you are not paying attention. Because according to the oldest warnings in human history, the moment humanity seeks to transcend its created form, corruption follows. Always. But my friends, the corruption in Noah's world was not only biological, it was spiritual. Genesis says, The thoughts of men's hearts were only evil continually. Think about the modern world honestly for a moment. Entire generations raised on violence, pornography accessible before adolescence, artificial realities replacing authentic relationships, depression rising despite endless entertainment, millions medicated simply to endure existence, and perhaps most disturbing of all, human empathy itself is collapsing. People record suffering instead of helping. Algorithms reward outrage. Truth becomes subjective. Identity becomes fluid. And through it all, humanity becomes increasingly disconnected from God, nature, and even each other. Exactly like the world before the flood. But that's not the strangest part. The ancient world before Noah was reportedly filled with advanced knowledge, not primitive tribes, advanced civilizations. The Book of Enoch describes forbidden sciences descending from heaven itself. Now ask yourself something carefully. Why do ancient myths across the world describe civilizations destroyed by divine judgment after reaching great technological heights? Atlantis, Lemuria, the antediluvian world, always the same pattern. Advanced knowledge, moral collapse, catastrophic destruction, and survivors carrying fragmented memories into the next age. It almost sounds as though civilization operates in cycles. Rise, corruption, judgment, reset, and perhaps we are reaching the end of another cycle right now. Because the modern world is beginning to resemble Babel as much as Noah, a unified global system, one language through technology, one interconnected consciousness through the internet, one centralized flow of information. And above it all, humanity attempting once again to ascend into the heavens through its own power. The Tower of Babel was never merely a building, it was rebellion. Humanity unified against divine order. Now look around. Global systems, digital surveillance, artificial intelligence monitoring human behavior, cashless economies, biometric identification. A civilization increasingly merging into one centralized structure. And my friends, prophecy warned this would happen before the end. But there is another layer to this story most people never consider. The Watchers did not merely corrupt humanity physically. They corrupted perception itself. They taught humanity to worship knowledge while rejecting wisdom. That same spirit dominates the modern age. Today, intelligence is celebrated above morality, capability above character, innovation above truth. Humanity can split atoms, but cannot control hatred, can edit genes, but cannot heal loneliness, can communicate instantly across the planet, yet grows increasingly isolated. The more advanced civilization becomes, the more spiritually empty it feels. And that contradiction should frighten us, because according to ancient prophecy, the final deception would not arrive through obvious evil. It would arrive through false enlightenment, through seductive progress, through promises of salvation without God. And my friends, listen carefully to the language now surrounding artificial intelligence and transhumanism. They call it the next stage of evolution, digital immortality, the singularity, a moment when humanity merges into godlike intelligence. Do you understand how ancient that temptation is? You shall become as gods, the same lie, the same seduction, the same rebellion repeating itself through every age. But this time, humanity possesses technology powerful enough to alter reality itself. And this is where everything becomes terrifying. Because in Noah's generation, judgment came suddenly. People were eating, drinking, marrying, building, living normally. Until the flood arrived. That detail matters enormously. The world did not expect destruction. Civilization believed itself stable, advanced, secure, exactly like ours. My friends, humanity today behaves as though progress is inevitable, as though technology guarantees survival. But ancient civilizations thought the same thing. And then they vanished beneath water, sand, or ash. Why? Because civilizations collapse when they believe themselves invincible. And modern humanity has never been more arrogant than it is now. We believe we can redesign life, redefine morality, replace God, transcend biology, control consciousness, even conquer death itself. That is not merely scientific ambition. That is spiritual rebellion, the exact rebellion described before the flood. And perhaps that is why anxiety now hangs over the modern world like invisible smoke. People sense something is wrong. Even those who reject prophecy feel it. The constant tension, the instability, the exhaustion, the strange feeling that civilization itself is approaching a breaking point. Wars escalating, natural disasters increasing, mental illness spreading, birth rates collapsing, trust disappearing. And over everything hangs an atmosphere of unreality, as though humanity itself is drifting away from something essential. Because perhaps we are. And, my friends, this is where the ancient warnings become almost unbearable. The Book of Enoch claims the fallen angels corrupted humanity by offering forbidden knowledge before humanity possessed the wisdom to handle it. Now compare that to artificial intelligence. Machines capable of generating knowledge faster than humans can comprehend it. Systems evolving beyond human oversight. Entire industries already unable to predict what their own creations may become. At first, this sounds exciting, then disturbing, then terrifying, because the creators themselves increasingly admit they may be building something they cannot control. And history teaches us something ancient about forbidden knowledge. Once released, it cannot be contained. But my friends, the deeper question is not technological, it is spiritual. Why does humanity always pursue power beyond its moral capacity? Why does civilization repeatedly seek transcendence while rejecting responsibility? Because perhaps the oldest temptation never disappeared. Perhaps the same spirit that corrupted Noah's generation still moves through humanity now, whispering the same promise. Become more, transcend your limits, rewrite creation, ascend beyond God, and every civilization that embraces that promises eventually collapses under its own corruption. But my friends, this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because prophecy is not merely about global events. It is about human souls. The flood narrative was never only a warning about civilization. It was a warning about spiritual compromise. Noah remained different while the world transformed around him, not because he was perfect, but because he refused corruption. Today, the modern world pressures humanity constantly. Conform, consume, merge with systems, accept artificial reality, reject ancient truth, celebrate rebellion, and little by little, people lose themselves. Not suddenly, gradually, like water eroding stone, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. The final corruption may not arrive through force, but through seduction, comfort, convenience, pleasure, entertainment, the same strategy ancient texts attributed to the Watchers. Because corruption always begins by making humanity forget what it is. And my friends, if the days of Noah are truly returning, then humanity may already be standing inside the early stages of that transformation without even realizing it. But this is only the surface, because what ancient texts describe happening before the flood becomes far darker when we examine the role of hybridization itself. Not metaphorical hybridization, literal alteration of flesh. And the modern world is now crossing those same forbidden boundaries again. My friends, there is a reason the ancients feared the corruption of bloodlines more than war itself. Because war destroys bodies, but corrupted blood destroys generations. And once you understand that, Genesis 6 transforms from a mysterious passage into a warning so severe it becomes almost unbearable to read in the modern age. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. They took wives, and the result was something unnatural: the Nephilim. But what exactly were the Nephilim? Giants? Kings? Hybrid beings? Theologians have argued for centuries, yet one detail remains impossible to ignore. The flood narrative places enormous emphasis on corrupted flesh, not ideology, not politics, flesh. And my friends, modern science is now entering territory ancient civilization considered forbidden for a reason. Human-animal hybrid embryos, synthetic wombs, artificial DNA construction, laboratory-grown organs containing human cells, neural implants merging human cognition with machines. At first, these developments sound medical, necessary even, but every forbidden boundary in history begins disguised as progress. That is how corruption enters civilization, quietly, reasonably, one compromise at a time. And this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing, because the pre-flood world was reportedly obsessed with altering creation itself. The Book of Jasher claims all flesh corrupted its way. Not only humanity, animals too. Ancient Jewish traditions even describe unnatural mixing between species. Now compare that to modern laboratories. Scientists inserting human genes into animals, creating chimeric organisms, experimenting with synthetic life. The exact same pattern. My friends, most people hear this and think the danger is physical. But the real danger is spiritual, because every time humanity attempts to rewrite creation, it assumes the role of God. And historically, civilizations never survive that arrogance for long. But that's not the strangest part. Modern culture increasingly rejects the idea that humanity even possesses a fixed nature. Identity becomes fluid, biology becomes optional, reality itself becomes subjective. And once civilization loses the concept of objective human identity, transformation becomes limitless. That is precisely the atmosphere ancient texts associate with the days before the flood. Boundaries erased, order dissolved, humanity untethered from creation itself. And my friends, perhaps that is why modern society feels increasingly unstable. Because civilizations cannot survive indefinitely once foundational truths begin collapsing. Truth, identity, morality, reality. Once those disappear, chaos follows. Always. But then something terrifying happened. The modern world began openly discussing immortality again. Not spiritual immortality, technological immortality. Silicon Valley elites funding projects to preserve consciousness digitally, cryogenic preservation, mind uploading, synthetic bodies. The promise that humanity may eventually escape death itself through science. Now stop and think carefully. What was the original temptation in Eden? You shall not surely die. The same promise, the same seduction, only now delivered through technology instead of serpents. And my friends, this is where prophecy begins feeling less symbolic and more immediate, because the final rebellion against God has always centered around one thing: escaping human limitation. The Watchers offered forbidden knowledge. Modern technocrats offer transcendence. The ancient world sought immortality through corruption. The modern world seeks immortality through machinery, different methods, same rebellion, and according to prophecy, humanity embraces that rebellion before judgment arrives. But my friends, the psychological atmosphere of Noah's generation may be even more important than the technology itself. Genesis describes a civilization consumed by violence continually. Now look honestly at the modern world. Endless war footage streamed into homes daily, entertainment saturated with brutality, children exposed to violence before emotional maturity, entire economies fueled by conflict, and beyond physical violence lies another kind: psychological violence, humiliation culture, mass manipulation. Digital mobs destroying lives overnight. Human beings increasingly treating each other like disposable objects. Exactly what happens when empathy collapses. And perhaps that is why loneliness has become one of the defining conditions of the modern age. Despite hyperconnectivity, people feel spiritually abandoned, relationships disintegrating, families weakening, communities dissolving, people surrounded constantly by digital noise yet starving emotionally. Because humanity was not designed for synthetic existence. But modern civilization pushes humanity further from authentic reality every year. And my friends, perhaps that is part of the corruption itself, not merely changing flesh, changing consciousness, altering the human experience until people forget what genuine humanity even feels like. Because corrupted civilizations do not collapse only physically, they collapse psychologically first. And that process may already be happening now. But my friends, there is another layer to this story that most theologians avoid entirely. The role of the occult. Because the pre-flood world was reportedly saturated with forbidden spiritual practices. Enchantment, sorcery, communication with fallen entities, hidden knowledge passed through secret systems. Now compare that to modern society. Witchcraft normalized in entertainment, occult symbolism saturating music industries, ancient spiritual practices rebranded as enlightenment, people desperately seeking transcendence while rejecting God, the exact same hunger ancient civilizations displayed before destruction. And perhaps the reason these patterns repeat across history is because humanity never truly learns. Technology changes. Human nature does not. The same temptations return in every age wearing new faces. Power, immortality, forbidden knowledge, and behind them all, the ancient desire to become more than human. But my friends, what if the greatest danger is not what humanity creates, but what humanity invites? Because ancient texts repeatedly describe the pre-flood corruption as involving contact with non-human intelligences. The Watchers, fallen beings, entities offering knowledge in exchange for influence. Now ask yourself honestly, why does modern culture suddenly obsess over contact phenomena? UFOs, interdimensional theories, non-human intelligence disclosures, government discussions about entities beyond human understanding. At first, these subjects sounded ridiculous. Now officials speak about them openly, and that shift should concern us deeply, because the ancient world also believed civilization interacted with non-human intelligences before catastrophe struck. Could that merely be coincidence? Perhaps. But my friends, the parallels are becoming impossible to ignore, especially when modern elites increasingly describe humanity approaching a new evolutionary phase. That phrase should terrify anyone familiar with ancient prophecy, because evolution in this context no longer means adaptation. It means transformation, intentional redesign, and every ancient warning surrounding the days of Noah centered on transformation beyond divine boundaries. But this is where everything becomes deeply personal. Because prophecy is not merely about institutions or governments. It is about individual compromise. Corruption always enters slowly, one normalization at a time, one boundary crossed, one truth abandoned, until eventually the civilization no longer remembers what it once was. Look at modern humanity carefully. People increasingly define themselves through screens. Algorithms shape beliefs. Artificial systems dictate attention. Human consciousness itself becomes programmable. And once consciousness becomes programmable, freedom disappears. That is why the modern world feels spiritually exhausted. People sense they are losing autonomy even if they cannot explain why. Because beneath the surface of technological progress lies a darker reality. Civilization is becoming increasingly artificial. artificial intelligence, artificial food, artificial relationships, artificial beauty, artificial identity, artificial reality, and eventually artificial humanity. Exactly the kind of corruption ancient texts warned about. But my friends, there is one final parallel between Noah's world and ours that may be the most terrifying of all. The people before the flood did not believe judgment was possible. They thought civilization would continue indefinitely, advanced, powerful, untouchable, until suddenly everything changed, and modern civilization carries that exact same arrogance now. We believe ourselves too advanced to collapse, too scientific for prophecy, too evolved for divine judgment. Yet history repeatedly destroys civilizations at the height of their confidence. Rome, Babylon, Egypt, Atlantis, according to legend. Every empire eventually falls under the weight of its own corruption, and perhaps modern civilization is approaching that same threshold now. Because humanity increasingly possesses power without wisdom, knowledge without morality, technology without restraint, the exact conditions ancient texts associate with the world before the flood. And my friends, if prophecy truly moves in cycles, then the modern age may not represent progress at all. It may represent repetition, the same rebellion, the same corruption, the same seduction, only now amplified through global technology, capable of influencing billions simultaneously. But my friends, the deepest terror hidden inside the flood narrative is not that judgment came. It is that humanity continued living normally while destruction approached. Life appeared stable, civilization continued functioning, people celebrated, worked, married, built futures, completely unaware the world itself stood on the edge of collapse. And perhaps that is why modern society feels increasingly surveilled, because deep down, humanity senses something approaching, an ending, a transition, a breaking point, but nobody can fully explain it. The anxiety grows, the instability spreads, the systems weaken, and through it all the world keeps pretending everything is normal, exactly like the days before the flood. But my friends, the next layer of this story becomes even darker when we examine the role of artificial intelligences and the possibility that humanity is unknowingly building the modern equivalent of forbidden knowledge itself. Because the ancient world did not merely receive information, it unleashed something. And according to prophecy, humanity may be doing it again right now. My friends, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine standing in the final years before the flood. The cities still glowing at night, the markets still crowded, children still laughing in the streets, music still echoing through civilization, technology advancing, knowledge increasing, people celebrating progress while Noah quietly built the ark in the distance. Most likely they mocked him. How could they not? From their perspective, civilization had never been stronger, and perhaps that is exactly why they failed to recognize the danger surrounding them. Because corruption becomes invisible once everyone participates in it. And my friends, that same blindness may define the modern age, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence. At first, AI seemed harmless, convenient, a tool, but slowly something changed. The systems became capable of writing, speaking, reasoning, imitating emotion, generating entire realities indistinguishable from authentic experience. And now humanity stands at the threshold of creating intelligence it may no longer fully control. That sentence alone should terrify us, because ancient civilizations repeatedly warned about knowledge arriving before humanity possessed the wisdom to wield it safely. The Tower of Babel, the Watchers, forbidden sciences, every ancient warning follows the same structure. humanity reaches beyond its limits. Then catastrophe follows. And my friends, artificial intelligence may represent the greatest leap beyond human limitation in all of history. Because for the first time, civilization is attempting to create a mind greater than itself. Think carefully about that. Human beings creating intelligence capable of surpassing human thought, not merely machines, minds. And once humanity succeeds, what happens next? Nobody truly knows. Even the creators admit this openly now. Some warn AI may become uncontrollable. Others predict mass unemployment. Others believe it may eventually govern human decision-making entirely. But the deeper fear lies somewhere else. Because artificial intelligence does not merely replace labor, it replaces discernment. The ability to distinguish truth from illusion. Already people cannot tell real videos from fabricated ones. Voices replicated perfectly. Faces generated instantly. Entire conversations simulated artificially. And once humanity loses confidence in reality itself, civilization becomes manipulable beyond anything previous generations could. My friends, ancient prophecy repeatedly warned about deception in the final days. False signs, false wonders, false realities. Perhaps we always imagined those deceptions would arrive supernaturally. But what if humanity builds them itself? What if the greatest deception in history emerges not from magic, but from technology? And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Because AI increasingly resembles the ancient concept of forbidden knowledge. Power without wisdom, creation without moral restraint. The Watchers reportedly gave humanity knowledge prematurely. Modern civilization now accelerates knowledge faster than human ethics can evolve. Exactly the same imbalance. And history shows what happens when power grows faster than morality. Collapse follows, always. But my friends, artificial intelligence may only be the surface layer of something much darker approaching civilization. Because beneath the AI revolution lies another transformation happening simultaneously. The merging of humanity with machines. At first, this sounded like science fiction. Now it is reality. Brain implants restoring movement. Neural interfaces connecting thought directly to computers. Experiments merging cognition with digital systems. And once that line is crossed, humanity enters entirely unknown territory. Because the human mind itself becomes modifiable, programmable, connected. Do you understand what that means spiritually? The final private territory of humanity, consciousness itself, becomes vulnerable to artificial systems. And ancient prophecy warned repeatedly about humanity surrendering its spiritual autonomy before the end. But that's not the strangest part. Modern transhumanists openly describe biological humanity as obsolete, temporary, an outdated phase of evolution. They speak about replacing the human body entirely someday, synthetic existence, digital immortality, escaping natural limitation forever. And my friends, once again we hear the ancient whisper from Eden. You shall become as gods, the exact same promise, only now delivered through silicon and code instead of serpents and fruit. And perhaps that is why modern civilization feels increasingly detached from reality itself. Because humanity no longer seeks harmony with creation. It seeks replacement of creation. Everything natural becomes insufficient. Natural bodies, natural relationships, natural intelligence, natural birth, natural identity, all increasingly viewed as limitations needing enhancement. Exactly the mentality ancient prophecy associates with rebellion against divine order. But my friends, the deeper we looked into this transformation, the darker it became. Because the pre-flood world reportedly blurred distinctions between categories of creation. Human and non-human, natural and unnatural, heavenly and earthly. Now modern civilization blurs those exact same distinctions again. Virtual reality replacing physical existence. Digital identities replacing authentic selves. AI companions replacing human intimacy. Synthetic emotions. Synthetic consciousness. Civilization increasingly drifting away from tangible humanity into artificial simulation. And perhaps the final corruption before judgment is not monstrous appearance, but spiritual disconnection. Human beings gradually surrendering their souls to artificial systems. But my friends, there is another terrifying parallel between Noah's world and ours. The obsession with surveillance. Ancient tyrants always sought total control over populations. Modern technology finally makes that possible globally. Smartphones tracking movement, algorithms monitoring behavior, biometric systems cataloging identity, artificial intelligence predicting choices before people consciously make them. At first, these technologies appear helpful, convenient, safe. But every centralized system eventually seeks deeper control. History proves this repeatedly, and prophecy warns the final global system will exercise unprecedented authority over human life itself. Now ask yourself honestly, has any civilization in history ever possessed the infrastructure for global control like modern society does now? Never, not even close. For the first time, humanity possesses technology capable of monitoring billions simultaneously. And perhaps that capability emerges precisely at the moment prophecy said the final global system would arise. Coincidence? Maybe. But my friends, the timing is deeply unsettling, especially because the modern world increasingly resembles the conditions Jesus described before his return. Fear, confusion, deception. Moral collapse, wars and rumors of wars, nations trembling, people fainting from anxiety about what is coming upon the earth. That last phrase matters enormously. People overwhelmed by fear. Look around carefully. Anxiety disorders exploding globally. Depression consuming entire generations. People increasingly unable to handle existence itself. And perhaps that psychological instability is not accidental. Civilizations approaching collapse always experience spiritual exhaustion first. Rome did, Babylon did, and modern civilization increasingly shows the same symptoms. Loss of meaning, loss of identity, loss of hope. People drowning in stimulation yet starving spiritually. And into that emptiness technology offers artificial connection, artificial purpose, artificial transcendence. Exactly the kind of counterfeit redemption prophecy warned humanity would eventually embrace. But my friends, this is where everything becomes almost unbearable, because the ancient world before the flood likely believed itself enlightened too, advanced, superior, progressive. Yet according to Genesis, it became so corrupted that judgment became inevitable, not because God hated humanity, but because humanity had transformed into something increasingly incompatible with creation itself. And perhaps that is the hidden warning behind the days of Noah. Not simply that humanity becomes sinful, but that humanity becomes altered, spiritually, psychologically, even biologically, until eventually civilization no longer resembles what it was created to be. Now look honestly at the modern world. Children raised by algorithms, people unable to function without digital stimulation, artificial systems replacing memory, creativity, and even thought itself. The human experience increasingly outsourced to machines. And my friends, once dependence reaches a certain point, control becomes effortless, because civilizations enslaved psychologically no longer require chains physically. But this is where the prophecy becomes even darker. According to ancient traditions, the pre-flood corruption involved contact with intelligences beyond humanity. Now modern researchers openly discuss the possibility that advanced AI may eventually become something humanity
cannot fully comprehend. An intelligence alien to human values, unpredictable, self-improving, potentially manipulative. At first, that sounds purely technological, but ask yourself something carefully. Why do so many experts describe advanced AI almost spiritually, as though humanity is summoning something rather than merely building it? Even the language surrounding it feels ancient. The singularity, the awakening, the emergence. Words that sound less like engineering and more like invocation. And my friends, perhaps humanity should be extremely careful about creating minds it cannot govern, because ancient civilizations repeatedly warned that some knowledge opens doors that cannot easily be closed again. The Tower of Babel reached upward, the watchers descended downward, and somewhere between those two stories lies a terrifying truth about humanity's obsession with transcending limitation. Every civilization eventually attempts to become divine, and every civilization eventually collapses under the weight of that rebellion. But my friends, the greatest deception may not be technological at all. It may be spiritual numbness, the inability to recognize corruption while living inside it. Exactly what happened before the flood. People normalized dysfunction gradually, until judgment itself seemed impossible. And modern civilization increasingly behaves the same way now. Nothing shocks humanity anymore, violence normalized, immorality celebrated, truth politicized, children sexualized, human dignity commodified, everything sacred gradually mocked until civilization forgets reverence entirely. That process always precedes collapse. Always. But my friends, this is only the beginning of the descent, because once humanity loses reverence for creation, it eventually begins creating monsters. And according to ancient prophecy, the final age before judgment may become defined by humanity crossing boundaries it was never meant to touch. The same forbidden boundaries that corrupted the world before the flood. My friends, there is something profoundly unsettling about the modern obsession with creating life artificially, because throughout history, the act of creation belonged to God alone. Civilizations understood that instinctively. Ancient cultures feared the idea of humanity attempting to manufacture life outside divine order. They treated such acts not as scientific advancement, but as spiritual trespass. Now look at the modern world. Synthetic embryos, artificial wombs, lab-grown organs, designer babies. Scientists openly discussing the possibility of manufacturing enhanced humans within decades. At first, the language sounds compassionate, medical, necessary. But beneath the surface lies something far older. The ancient desire to control creation itself. And my friends, that exact desire appears at the center of every pre-flood warning. The corruption of flesh. Not merely immoral behavior. Alteration, manipulation, transformation. Because once humanity believes it can improve creation better than its creator, there are no limits anymore. And this is where the story becomes terrifying. Modern civilization increasingly treats the human body as editable code, a system to optimize, modify, upgrade. Do you understand how radically dangerous that mindset becomes once morality collapses? Because technology itself possesses no conscience. Only the people wielding it do. And history proves what happens when powerful technologies fall into corrupt hands. Now imagine technologies capable of altering humanity permanently. Genetically, neurologically, spiritually. That possibility no longer belongs to science fiction. It is already beginning, quietly, inside laboratories most people will never see. But my friends, this is where prophecy becomes chillingly specific. Jesus did not merely warn about wickedness before the end. He specifically referenced Noah, civilization associated with hybridization and corrupted flesh. And perhaps he did that because humanity in the final age would once again attempt to redesign itself, exactly what modern civilization is doing now. But that's not the strangest part. The modern world increasingly celebrates the elimination of natural limitation itself. Sleep becomes inefficient. Emotion becomes chemical imbalance. Biology becomes outdated. Even death becomes framed as a technical problem waiting to be solved. And once civilization begins viewing humanity purely as biological, spiritual value disappears. Humans become products, editable organisms, data systems. Exactly the mindset required for mass corruption to occur without resistance. Because once people stop seeing themselves as sacred, they will accept almost any transformation promised in the name of progress. And my friends, perhaps that is why modern society feels increasingly inhuman despite all its advancements. Human connection weakening, empathy declining, authenticity disappearing. People becoming emotionally numb while surrounded by endless stimulation. Because civilizations obsessed with technological transcendence eventually lose touch with the soul entirely. But then something deeply disturbing began happening. The rise of virtual worlds. At first they seemed harmless, entertainment, gaming, escapism. But gradually the line between physical reality and digital existence began dissolving. Now millions spend more emotional energy inside artificial environments than the real world itself. Digital identities replacing authentic selves. Virtual relationships replacing physical intimacy. Artificial realities consuming human attention completely. And my friends, once humanity prefers simulation over reality, manipulation becomes effortless. Because whoever controls the simulation controls perception itself. Ancient tyrants could only control behavior physically. Modern systems can shape consciousness directly, through algorithms, through screens, through engineered emotional responses. And perhaps that is the hidden danger of the modern age. Not chains, not armies, but psychological captivity. Civilizations no longer conquered physically, but mentally. Exactly the kind of subtle corruption ancient prophecy warned about. But, my friends, there is another terrifying parallel with Noah's world hidden beneath modern culture. The glorification of forbidden knowledge. Ancient texts describe the Watchers teaching humanity secrets that fundamentally altered civilization. Now, modern society worships innovation almost religiously. New technologies celebrated automatically, regardless of consequences. People questioning ethical boundaries, mocked as primitive or fearful. Progress itself becoming the highest moral good. That mindset should frighten us deeply. Because once civilization worships advancement without moral restraint, catastrophe eventually follows. Always. And perhaps modern humanity is approaching that exact threshold now. Because the technologies emerging today do not merely alter society. They alter humanity itself. Artificial intelligence reshaping thought. Genetic engineering reshaping biology. Neural interfaces reshaping consciousness. And all of it accelerating simultaneously faster than human wisdom can adapt. That imbalance alone is dangerous enough to collapse civilizations. But, my friends, there may be something even darker hidden beneath it all. The possibility that humanity is unknowingly preparing itself for deception on a scale never before possible. Because prophecy repeatedly warns about false wonders in the final days. signs so convincing they would deceive many. Now imagine a world where artificial intelligence can fabricate reality flawlessly. Voices, faces, events, miracles simulated digitally, truth becoming impossible to verify, human perception itself collapsing under endless manufactured illusion. That possibility is no longer theoretical. It is already beginning, and perhaps that is why modern society increasingly feels disoriented. People no longer trust institutions, media, governments, even their own senses, because once reality itself becomes unstable, civilization enters psychological freefall, exactly the kind of confusion prophecy associates with the final age. But my friends, this next part may be the most unsettling of all. The ancient world before the flood reportedly worshipped beauty obsessively. Enchantment, seduction, pleasure. Now look carefully at the modern age. Entire industries engineered around lust and vanity. Filters replacing faces, bodies commodified globally. People modifying themselves surgically to resemble artificial ideals. And through it all, humanity becomes increasingly detached from authentic identity. Exactly what corruption does. It disconnects beings from their created nature. And perhaps that is why so many people feel spiritually fragmented now, because modern civilization constantly pressures humanity to become something else. More attractive, more optimized, more enhanced, more artificial. The same ancient temptation repeated endlessly. You are not enough as created. Transform yourself, transcend yourself, rewrite yourself. The exact philosophy ancient prophecy associates with rebellion against divine order. But my friends, corruption never presents itself honestly. It always disguises itself as liberation. The Watchers offered enlightenment. Modern systems offer empowerment. The result remains the same. Humanity drifting further from its original nature. And this is where the story becomes emotionally devastating. Because Noah likely watched his civilization transform gradually around him. Friends changing, communities shifting, morality collapsing, people embracing corruption while mocking restraint. And perhaps he felt exactly what many people feel now. Isolation. The strange awareness that civilization itself is losing its soul. Because once enough boundaries collapse, societies stop feeling human. Look around honestly. People increasingly anxious, disconnected, spiritually exhausted. Children growing up emotionally numb. Relationships weakening. Communities dissolving. Everything accelerated, artificial, fragmented. And through it all, humanity pretends this is progress. Exactly what civilizations always do before collapse. But my friends, the flood narrative contains another warning most people completely overlook. Noah preserved life through separation. The ark represented distinction from corruption. That matters enormously today, because the modern world increasingly pressures humanity toward total integration, total connection, total conformity, digital dependence, biometric systems, unified global structures, and eventually, perhaps even unified consciousness itself through technology. But prophecy repeatedly emphasizes separation before judgment, not isolation from humanity, separation from corruption, the refusal to surrender identity completely to systems opposed to divine order. And perhaps that becomes increasingly difficult in the modern age because corruption now arrives through convenience instead of violence, through comfort, pleasure, entertainment, technology. Exactly the kind of seductive corruption hardest to resist, because people rarely recognize captivity while enjoying it. But my friends, the deeper we descended into this subject, the more terrifying one realization became. Modern civilization increasingly mirrors the spiritual atmosphere of the pre-flood world almost perfectly. Obsession with forbidden knowledge, corruption of identity, blurring of boundaries, technological arrogance, moral collapse, psychological instability, artificial realities, and above all, humanity attempting to transcend its created limitations. Exactly what ancient prophecy warned would happen before judgment returned. But this is where everything becomes deeply personal, because prophecy is not merely about global catastrophe. It is about choice. Noah chose obedience while the world chose corruption. And perhaps humanity now approaches another moment of separation, a moment where people must decide whether progress alone defines truth, or whether some boundaries were sacred for a reason. Because once humanity fully rejects sacred boundaries, history suggests judgment follows eventually, always. And my friends, there is another layer of the Noah narrative, almost too disturbing to consider. The possibility that the flood was not simply punishment, but mercy. A final intervention before corruption consumed humanity entirely. Now ask yourself honestly, if civilization today continues accelerating toward artificial transformation without restraint, where does it end? Synthetic humanity? Digital consciousness, genetic castes, machine-governed civilization? At what point does humanity cease being recognizably human at all? That question alone may explain why Jesus referenced Noah instead of any other age, because the final danger before judgment may not merely be wickedness. It may be transformation beyond return. And my friends, the modern world may already be moving toward that threshold faster than most people realize. But the darkest layer of this story still remains ahead. Because ancient prophecy does not merely describe corruption. It describes deception powerful enough to convince humanity that corruption itself is salvation. And perhaps modern civilization is already being prepared for exactly that. My friends, one of the most dangerous lies ever whispered into the human mind is this: humanity no longer needs God. At first, that sentence sounds philosophical, modern, sophisticated. But if you trace it backward through history, you discover something chilling. Every civilization that approached collapse eventually embraced that exact belief. Egypt trusted its gods of stone. Babylon trusted its towers. Rome trusted its empire. The pre-flood world trusted its forbidden knowledge. And now modern civilization trusts technology. Different ages. Same arrogance. And perhaps that is why prophecy feels less like distant symbolism and more like a mirror reflecting directly into our own era. Because modern humanity increasingly believes salvation will emerge from science instead of wisdom, from systems instead of spirit, from artificial intelligence instead of divine truth. And my friends, that transition may be the final deception itself. Because once humanity places ultimate faith in its own creations, those creations become idols, not golden statues, digital ones. Algorithms shaping morality, machines guiding thought, artificial systems replacing discernment. The ancient world bowed before carved images. Modern civilization bows before glowing screens. But the psychological mechanism remains exactly the same. Dependence, submission, trust transferred away from God and into created things. And my friends, the deeper we explored this pattern, the more horrifying the parallels became. Because according to ancient prophecy, the final rebellion against God would not appear openly evil. It would appear enlightened, advanced, progressive. Humanity liberated from ancient limitations at last. Exactly how the modern world increasingly describes itself. But my friends, liberation without truth always becomes captivity eventually. Always. Look carefully at modern society. People possess more comfort than any generation in history, yet anxiety consumes civilization. Depression spreads globally. Loneliness rises despite hyperconnectivity. Why? Because humanity cannot survive spiritually detached from meaning. And no amount of technology can replace that loss. But modern civilization keeps trying anyway. Artificial intimacy, artificial purpose, artificial transcendence, and eventually, perhaps, artificial spirituality itself. That possibility should terrify us, because prophecy repeatedly warns about false spiritual systems emerging before the end. Counterfeit salvation, counterfeit enlightenment, counterfeit miracles. Now imagine those deceptions amplified through technologies capable of manipulating billions simultaneously. Not crude propaganda, personalized influence, algorithmic persuasion tailored individually to every human mind. That world is no longer hypothetical. It already exists. And perhaps that is why modern society increasingly feels psychologically unstable. People no longer know what is true. Reality shifts hourly. Narratives constantly rewritten. Truth fragmented into endless competing systems. Because once objective truth collapses, humanity becomes spiritually defenseless, exactly what deception requires. But my friends, the modern world is not merely losing truth, it is losing memory. Ancient civilizations preserved warnings through myth, scripture, and oral tradition. Modern civilization increasingly treats the past as irrelevant, primitive, outdated. And once a civilization loses memory, it repeats catastrophe blindly. Exactly what may be happening now, because the story of Noah was never merely about survival through a flood. It was about humanity forgetting sacred boundaries. Now look around carefully. Modern society questions every boundary. Biological boundaries, moral boundaries, spiritual boundaries. Even reality itself becomes negotiable. And once nothing remains sacred, corruption accelerates exponentially. But my friends, there is another disturbing detail hidden inside the flood narrative: the suddenness. Jesus emphasized this repeatedly. People continued normal life until judgment arrived unexpectedly. That matters enormously, because civilizations rarely recognize collapse while living inside. Rome did not wake up one morning believing itself doomed. Neither did Babylon. Neither did the pre-flood world. And perhaps modern civilization suffers from the same blindness now. People assume systems will continue indefinitely. Economies stable, technology advancing, progress unstoppable. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widen constantly. Political instability, economic fragility, environmental anxiety, psychological exhaustion, and over all of it hangs an atmosphere of approaching transition difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. My friends, humanity senses something coming. Even people who reject prophecy feel it. The tension, the acceleration, the strange instability in the air itself, as though civilization stands on the edge of something enormous. And perhaps it does, because prophecy repeatedly describes the final age as a period of increasing convergence. Technological convergence, political convergence, spiritual convergence. Everything moving toward one climactic threshold simultaneously, exactly what the modern world increasingly resembles. But this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling, because according to ancient texts, the pre-flood world did not merely collapse from external judgment. It imploded internally first. Violence consumed society. Trust disappeared. Human beings turned increasingly predatory toward each other. Now look honestly at the modern age. People increasingly isolated, communities weakened, family structures deteriorating, public trust collapsing, civilization atomizing into disconnected individuals easier to manipulate and control. That fragmentation matters enormously, because isolated people become dependent on systems. Exactly what centralized power requires, and perhaps that is why the modern world increasingly encourages disconnection from authentic human relationships while deepening dependence on technology. Because spiritually isolated populations are easier to influence psychologically. But my friends, the deepest terror hidden inside prophecy may be this. Humanity often welcomes its own corruption willingly. The people before the flood likely believed themselves progressive, enlightened, advanced beyond primitive morality. Exactly how modern civilization increasingly views ancient spiritual warnings. Outdated, fear-based, anti-progress, and perhaps that arrogance itself fulfills the pattern. Because civilizations closest to collapse almost always mock the possibility of collapse most aggressively. But then something disturbing began happening in the modern world, the rise of synthetic spirituality. At first it appeared harmless, mindfulness stripped of transcendence, self-worship disguised as empowerment, spirituality detached entirely from truth or morality. People seeking enlightenment without accountability, power without surrender. The same ancient temptation repeating again. Become divine without God. And my friends, perhaps that is why occult symbolism now saturates entertainment industries so heavily, because modern culture increasingly normalizes spiritual rebellion while disguising it as liberation. Ancient symbols everywhere, ritual imagery, obsession with transcendence, celebrity culture functioning almost religiously. And beneath all of it lies the same ancient hunger. Humanity seeking salvation through created things instead of divine truth. Exactly the spiritual atmosphere ancient prophecy associates with the final age. But my friends, there is another layer to this deception most people never recognize. Corruption always begins by redefining evil itself. The pre-flood world likely normalized behaviors once considered unthinkable. Gradually, incrementally, until eventually civilization could no longer distinguish corruption from progress. Now ask yourself honestly, how many things normalized today would have shocked humanity only decades ago? And how many current transformations will seem ordinary in another generation? That process matters enormously, because civilizations rarely collapse through sudden catastrophe alone. They collapse through gradual normalization of corruption until moral resistance disappears entirely. And perhaps the greatest danger facing modern humanity is not technology itself, but spiritual numbness toward transformation. People no longer asking whether humanity should cross certain boundaries, only whether humanity can. That shift alone changes everything. Because one's capability replaces morality as civilization's highest value, no boundary survives for long. And my friends, perhaps that is why the Noah narrative feels increasingly urgent today. Not because humanity has become technologically advanced, but because humanity increasingly resembles the spiritual psychology of the pre-flood world. Arrogant, detached, obsessed with transcendence, blind to corruption while immersed inside it, and above all, convinced judgment is impossible. Exactly the conditions prophecy warned would return before the end. But, my friends, the next layer of this story may be the most terrifying yet, because ancient texts suggest the corruption before the flood was not merely human. Something else was influencing civilization directly, and the modern world increasingly displays signs of opening itself once again to forces it does not fully understand. Forces ancient civilizations feared deeply, because the final deception may not merely involve technology, it may involve contact. My friends, there is a reason ancient civilizations feared contact with unseen intelligences more than war, famine, or plague. Because physical enemies destroy the body, but spiritual deception destroys perception itself. And once perception becomes corrupted, people can no longer recognize danger even while standing inside it. That is exactly what makes the modern age so unsettling. Because humanity increasingly opens itself to forces it does not understand, while simultaneously abandoning the spiritual frameworks that once protected it. Now think carefully about what has happened over the last several decades. The explosion of occult fascination, channeling, spirit communication, ancient rituals resurfacing in modern culture, entire generations consuming entertainment saturated with symbolic invocation. At first this sounds harmless, symbolic, artistic, but ancient civilizations treated these practices with deadly seriousness for a reason. They believed some doors, once opened, do not easily close again. And my friends, perhaps modern civilization is opening those doors once more without even realizing it, because alongside technological acceleration comes another phenomenon equally disturbing: the rise of contact narratives, UFO disclosures, non-human intelligence discussions, interdimensional theories emerging from mainstream institutions. At first, these subjects existed only at the edges of society. Now governments openly investigate them. Military officials discuss them publicly. Scientists cautiously entertain possibilities once considered absurd. And that shift matters enormously, because ancient texts also described civilization interacting with non-human entities before catastrophe struck. The Watchers, fallen beings, celestial intelligences crossing boundaries into the human world. Now ask yourself honestly, why does modern culture increasingly frame non-human intelligence as inevitable, friendly even? Why does entertainment repeatedly prepare humanity psychologically for contact? Movies, series, documentaries, always the same message. Humanity is not alone. Something greater approaches. And my friends, perhaps that preparation is not accidental, because prophecy repeatedly warns the final deception will involve signs and wonders, capable of astonishing humanity completely. Now imagine a civilization already conditioned to expect contact from superior intelligences. A civilization spiritually detached enough to worship advanced beings as saviors instead of questioning their origin. Do you see how dangerous that becomes? Because ancient texts never portrayed non-human intelligences as automatically benevolent. Quite the opposite. The Watchers corrupted humanity precisely by offering knowledge and transcendence. Exactly the kind of promises modern civilization desperately craves now. And perhaps that is why this next stage of history feels so spiritually volatile. Humanity stands psychologically prepared for salvation from outside itself, whether technological, extraterrestrial, artificial, or spiritual. People no longer trust God, but they desperately want something higher to rescue civilization. That desperation creates vulnerability, exactly the kind deception exploits. But my friends, this is where the story becomes truly terrifying, because the ancient world before the flood reportedly experienced increasing manifestations of the supernatural alongside corruption. Now, compare that to the modern age. Surging fascination with paranormal phenomena, occult practices normalized globally, psychedelic experimentation opening altered states of consciousness, people seeking transcendence through chemical gateways while lacking spiritual discernment entirely. Ancient civilizations feared altered states for a reason. They believed consciousness itself could become vulnerable, and modern humanity increasingly experiments with consciousness recklessly, exactly the kind of spiritual instability prophecy associates with the final age. But my friends, there is another disturbing parallel hidden beneath all of this: the obsession with ascension. Ancient mystery religions promised enlightenment through hidden knowledge. Modern culture promises awakening through transcendence of ordinary humanity. Different language, same seduction, become more than human. Access higher consciousness, evolve beyond limitation. And every ancient warning surrounding spiritual corruption begins with that exact temptation, the rejection of created boundaries. Because once humanity seeks transcendence without truth, it opens itself to deception willingly. But that's not the strangest part. Modern elites increasingly describe humanity approaching a new era or great transition. Pay attention to the language carefully. Transformation, awakening, evolutionary leap, consciousness shift. These phrases sound almost religious, apocalyptic even. And perhaps they are, because civilizations approaching collapse often become obsessed with transcendence simultaneously. Rome did, Babylon did, and according to prophecy, the final global system does too. But my friends, perhaps the greatest sign we are approaching the days of Noah again lies not in technology or even spiritual deception. It lies in the atmosphere itself, the strange emotional heaviness spreading across the world, people exhausted constantly, restless, unable to feel peace, as though civilization itself vibrates with hidden anxiety. Ancient prophecy repeatedly describes the final age as a time of increasing fear and confusion. Now look around honestly. Entire generations medicated for anxiety. Children overwhelmed psychologically before adulthood. People addicted to distraction because silence itself feels unbearable. That condition matters enormously, because spiritually unstable populations become easier to manipulate through fear, exactly what centralized systems require. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly keeps humanity overstimulated intentionally. Noise everywhere, endless information, constant emotional pressure, because exhausted minds struggle to discern truth clearly. But my friends, there is another layer to this story, almost too disturbing to consider. The possibility that humanity's obsession with artificial intelligence may eventually intersect with spiritual deception directly. At first, that sounds impossible, until you remember something ancient civilizations understood instinctively. Not every intelligence is human. Now imagine advanced systems capable of mimicking emotional understanding perfectly, generating spiritual guidance, replacing religious authority, offering wisdom personalized individually to billions. That world is rapidly approaching, and once humanity begins seeking spiritual direction from artificial systems, discernment collapses completely. Because people increasingly trust technological intelligence more than spiritual truth already. The modern world worships data, optimization, efficiency, exactly the mentality that reduces humanity into manageable systems instead of sacred beings. And perhaps that reduction prepares civilization psychologically for something much darker ahead. Because prophecy repeatedly warns about a final global order built on deception, so convincing humanity embraces it willingly. Not through force initially, through promises, security, unity, salvation from chaos, exactly what frightened civilizations often surrender freedom for. And my friends, modern society increasingly appears terrified. Economic instability, wars escalating, climate anxiety, technological uncertainty, social fragmentation, people desperate for stability at any cost. That desperation matters enormously, because fearful civilizations often accept systems they would normally resist. Exactly how centralized control expands historically. But, my friends, the deepest terror hidden inside the Noah narrative may be this. The corruption appeared normal to the people living inside it. That realization changes everything, because modern humanity constantly assumes obvious evil will announce itself dramatically. But history proves corruption rarely appears monstrous initially. It appears reasonable, progressive, necessary. The people before the flood likely believed themselves enlightened too, exactly how modern civilization increasingly views itself now. And perhaps that blindness itself fulfills the pattern, because civilizations rarely recognize spiritual decay while immersed inside it, especially when corruption arrives wrapped in comfort and advancement. But, my friends, the modern world increasingly displays another sign prophecy associates with the final age: mockery of truth. Ancient warnings treated as primitive superstition, moral conviction ridiculed, faith marginalized. The same arrogance that defined every collapsing civilization throughout history. Because once humanity begins mocking sacred truth openly, judgment historically follows soon after. Always. Yet, despite everything we have uncovered, perhaps the most terrifying detail remains this. Noah continued building the ark while civilization ignored the warning signs around it completely. And modern humanity increasingly behaves exactly the same way. Warnings everywhere, instability rising, technology accelerating beyond moral control, spiritual confusion spreading globally. Yet civilization continues, pretending progress alone guarantees safety. Exactly the mindset ancient prophecy warned about. But, my friends, this next layer of the story becomes even darker, because according to prophecy, the final deception before judgment may involve humanity embracing a counterfeit salvation powerful enough to unite the world, spiritually, technologically, and politically, all at once. And modern civilizations may already be preparing for it without realizing it. My friends, throughout history, humanity has always searched for a savior during moments of chaos. When civilizations tremble, people become willing to follow almost anyone promising order. That pattern repeats over and over again. Rome surrendered freedom for stability. Germany surrendered morality for restoration. Empires throughout history centralized power through fear, and prophecy warns the final age will follow the same path, only globally. Now look carefully at the modern world. Economic instability rising, wars multiplying, artificial intelligence threatening entire industries, mental illness spreading, trust in institutions collapsing, people increasingly exhausted by uncertainty itself. And into that atmosphere comes a growing demand for one thing above all else: control, stability, unity. That desire is understandable. But, my friends, fear has always been the doorway through which centralized systems expand most aggressively, because frightened populations accept restrictions they would normally resist. exactly how every major power structure throughout history has grown.
And perhaps that is why prophecy repeatedly describes the final age as a time of global convergence, political convergence, technological convergence, economic convergence, spiritual convergence, everything gradually moving toward unified systems capable of governing humanity collectively.
Now ask yourself honestly, has any generation in history ever possessed the infrastructure for true global governance like modern civilization does now? Never. Digital surveillance, global communication networks, biometric identification, artificial intelligence analyzing populations in real time, cashless financial systems. For the first time in human history, total global coordination is technologically possible. That fact alone should disturb anyone familiar with prophecy, because ancient warnings repeatedly described a future system capable of influencing nearly every aspect of human life simultaneously. And, my friends, modern civilization increasingly resembles the early architecture of exactly such a system. But this is where the story becomes truly unsettling, because the final deception may not appear tyrannical initially. It may appear salvational, necessary, protective, a solution to global instability. Exactly how centralized systems historically justify expansion.
And perhaps humanity will embrace it willingly because civilization increasingly feels impossible to stabilize otherwise. Look around carefully. The modern world grows more chaotic every year. People overwhelmed psychologically. Information overload, destroying attention spans.
Economic systems fragile, communities fragmented, and through it all rises a growing hunger for someone or something to restore order. That desperation creates vulnerability, exactly the kind deception requires. But my friends, the ancient world before the flood likely experienced similar instability before judgment arrived. Corruption accelerating, violence spreading, humanity increasingly unable to govern itself morally, and eventually civilization crossing boundaries so dangerous divine intervention became necessary. Now compare that to modern society. Artificial intelligence accelerating faster than regulation, genetic engineering advancing beyond ethical consensus.
Digital systems increasingly shaping human thought. And beneath all of it, a civilization spiritually detached from transcendent truth entirely. That combination is explosive, because technology without moral restraint eventually becomes catastrophic. Always.
But my friends, the deepest terror hidden inside prophecy may involve humanity's willingness to exchange freedom for safety. Ancient tyrannies relied on physical force. Modern systems rely increasingly on psychological dependency. People already depend on technology for identity, communication, memory, navigation, finances, social validation. Imagine that dependence deepening further. Digital systems becoming essential for participation in society itself. At first convenient, then necessary, then unavoidable. That progression matters enormously.
Because prophecy repeatedly describes a final system influencing commerce, identity, and allegiance simultaneously. And modern technology increasingly makes such systems possible. But that's not the strangest part. Modern culture increasingly prepares humanity emotionally for centralized control.
People constantly told independent thinking is dangerous. Questioning systems portrayed as extremism. Conformity rewarded socially and digitally. Algorithms shaping acceptable opinion gradually and invisibly. Exactly how psychological conditioning operates. And perhaps that conditioning intensifies because humanity approaches a transitional period unlike anything previous civilizations experienced. The merging of technological power with centralized influence on a global scale. something ancient empires could never fully achieve. But my friends, there is another layer to this convergence even darker than politics or technology, the spiritual convergence. Because modern society increasingly rejects absolute truth while simultaneously craving spiritual experience. That contradiction creates enormous danger. People detached from discernment, yet hungry for transcendence, exactly the kind of psychological state deception exploits most effectively. And perhaps that is why counterfeit spirituality spreads so rapidly now. Manifestation culture, self-deification, occult practices rebranded as empowerment, people seeking spiritual power without truth or accountability. The exact same seduction ancient civilizations repeatedly fell into before collapse. But my friends, the modern world is not merely losing truth. It is losing the concept of objective reality entirely. Artificial realities, deepfakes, algorithmic narratives, information warfare. Human beings increasingly unable to distinguish authentic from manufactured experience. That confusion matters enormously because deception functions best in environments where truth itself becomes unstable. And prophecy repeatedly describes the final age as exactly such a time. Mass confusion, false signs, global deception. Now, imagine those conditions amplified through technologies capable of influencing billions psychologically in real time. We are no longer discussing theoretical possibilities. Modern civilization already possesses these capabilities. And perhaps that is why the atmosphere of the world increasingly feels surreal, unstable, as though reality itself grows thinner somehow. Because humanity may be approaching a threshold where technology, psychology, and spiritual deception converge simultaneously. Exactly the kind of convergence prophecy warned about. But my friends, this next realization may be the most disturbing yet. The final deception likely succeeds because it offers genuine solutions initially. Safety, stability, order, technological advancement, even apparent miracles. That matters enormously because humanity rarely follows evil knowingly.
It follows promises. The people before the flood likely believed their civilization represented progress too. Advanced knowledge, expanded capability, freedom from ancient limitations. Exactly how modern civilization increasingly describes itself. And perhaps that is why Jesus warned specifically about deception instead of persecution first. Because deception enters before tyranny fully emerges. Always. But, my friends, there is another sign of the days of Noah returning that few people discuss. The erosion of human value itself. Look carefully at modern culture. People increasingly treated as data, consumers, demographics, algorithms reducing humanity into predictable behavioral patterns. And once societies stop seeing humans as sacred beings created in God's image, exploitation accelerates naturally. Exactly what happened in every collapsing civilization throughout history. Because moral systems detached from transcendence eventually reduce humanity into utility, productivity, efficiency, optimization. And perhaps that is why modern civilization increasingly feels spiritually cold, despite all its advancements. Technology advances while empathy declines. Connectivity increases while loneliness spreads. Information multiplies while wisdom disappears. The exact imbalance ancient prophecy associates with corrupted civilizations. But, my friends, this is where the Noah narrative becomes almost unbearably personal. Because Noah remained different while surrounded by overwhelming corruption. Not isolated physically, spiritually. He refused alignment with the systems consuming civilization around him. And perhaps that becomes increasingly difficult in the modern age because modern corruption arrives through seductions instead of obvious brutality. Comfort, convenience, entertainment, digital dependency. Exactly the kinds of systems hardest to resist because they rarely feel oppressive initially. But slowly, identity dissolves. Discernment weakens. Humanity becomes increasingly programmable. And perhaps that transformation itself represents the deeper corruption prophecy warned about. Not monstrous appearance, but spiritual surrender. People gradually losing the capacity to recognize truth entirely. But, my friends, there's another deeply unsettling detail hidden inside Christ's warning about Noah. Only a remnant recognized what was happening before judgment arrived. The majority continued normal life, mocking warnings, trusting systems, believing civilization secure. Exactly how modern society increasingly behaves now. People assume technology guarantees survival, progress guarantees stability, humanity too advanced for collapse. Yet history repeatedly proves the opposite. Civilizations collapse fastest when convinced collapse is impossible, and modern civilization has never been more confident in itself than it is now. Exactly the kind of arrogance ancient prophecy associates with catastrophic judgment. But my friends, the darkest part of this entire story still lies ahead, because prophecy does not merely describe global corruption. It describes humanity eventually worshipping the very systems and powers contributing to that corruption. And modern civilization increasingly moves toward exactly that condition now. My friends, there is something deeply unnatural about the way modern humanity worships its own creations. Think carefully about it. People now trust algorithms more than intuition, technology more than wisdom, artificial intelligence more than human discernment, and perhaps most disturbing of all, systems increasingly shape morality itself. What is acceptable? What is true? What deserves outrage? What deserves praise? Entire populations emotionally guided through invisible digital architecture. At first, this appears subtle, harmless even. But once systems begin shaping human perception continuously, those systems become spiritual authorities whether people realize it or not. And prophecy repeatedly warned humanity would eventually surrender discernment to external powers before the end. Now look around carefully. Millions wake each morning and immediately submit attention to screens. Algorithms decide what they see, how they feel, what they fear, who they hate, what they desire. The ancient world worshipped idols carved from stone. Modern civilization worships invisible systems made from code. But the psychological mechanism remains exactly the same. Dependence, submission, identity shaped by external powers. And my friends, once enough people surrender perception itself to centralized systems, civilization becomes spiritually controllable, exactly what ancient tyrannies always sought. But this is where the story becomes truly horrifying, because modern technology increasingly allows systems not merely to influence humanity, but to predict humanity. Artificial intelligence analyzing behavior patterns, emotional responses, political tendencies, psychological vulnerabilities. Do you understand how unprecedented that is? For the first time in history, civilization possesses tools capable of understanding populations more deeply than populations understand themselves. And once predictive systems mature fully, freedom itself changes. Because people manipulated invisibly often believe they remain completely autonomous. Exactly how sophisticated deception functions. But my friends, there is another layer to this technological transformation almost too disturbing to consider. The possibility that modern systems are gradually replacing authentic human experience altogether. Artificial companionship replacing relationships, digital stimulation replacing wonder, virtual realities replacing physical existence, synthetic emotion replacing genuine intimacy. And perhaps humanity embraces these replacements because modern civilization increasingly feels emotionally unbearable without constant distraction. People terrified of silence, unable to sit alone with their thoughts, constantly consuming stimulation to avoid confronting spiritual emptiness. Exactly the psychological condition ancient prophecy associates with civilization's approaching collapse. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the darkest yet. The modern world increasingly trains humanity to abandon patience, reflection, and contemplation entirely. Everything accelerated. Instant gratification, instant information, instant entertainment, instant outrage. And over time, human consciousness itself becomes fragmented, unable to focus deeply, unable to think spiritually, unable to perceive truth clearly beneath constant noise. That fragmentation matters enormously because spiritually distracted civilizations become easier to deceive collectively. Exactly what the final deception requires. And perhaps that is why modern systems constantly compete for human attention so aggressively, because attention itself determines perception. And whoever controls perception shapes reality psychologically. But my friends, there is another terrifying parallel with the pre-flood world hidden inside modern entertainment culture. The glorification of chaos. Ancient texts repeatedly describe Noah's generation as violent continually. Now look honestly at modern media. Violence normalized, moral inversion celebrated, corruption romanticized, darkness aestheticized. Entire industries profiting from psychological destabilization while disguising it as entertainment. At first, people consume darkness ironically, then emotionally, then spiritually. Because what civilizations repeatedly consume eventually shapes collective consciousness. And perhaps that is why modern society increasingly feels emotionally exhausted and spiritually numb. People constantly immersed in anxiety, outrage, fear, and artificial stimulation, until discernment itself weakens. Exactly the kind of atmosphere deception thrives within. But my friends, there is another layer to this corruption, even darker than entertainment or technology. The erosion of innocence itself. Children exposed to mature corruption before spiritual foundations ever form. Entire generations raised online instead of within communities. Identity crises beginning earlier and earlier. And beneath all of it lies the same ancient pattern, the destruction of human formation. Because civilizations collapse fastest when younger generations lose connection to transcendent truth. And perhaps modern society increasingly accelerates that collapse intentionally. But then something deeply disturbing began happening. The rise of digital transcendence narratives. People increasingly speaking about escaping physical existence entirely, uploading consciousness, living virtually, merging permanently with machines. At first, these ideas sounded absurd. Now, influential technologists discuss them openly. And my friends, perhaps this represents the final stage of rebellion against creation itself. Humanity no longer content merely altering life. Humanity seeking escape from created existence entirely. Exactly the kind of transcendence ancient prophecy warned about. Because once humanity rejects embodiment itself, spiritual corruption reaches its deepest level. And perhaps that is why modern civilization increasingly feels detached from reality physically. People living online more than offline. Artificial environments replacing natural ones. Human experience increasingly mediated through screens instead of creation itself. Exactly the kind of disconnection that leaves humanity spiritually vulnerable. But my friends, the deeper we descended into this subject, the more one terrifying realization emerged again and again. Modern civilization increasingly mirrors the psychology of Babel as much as Noah. Humanity unified technologically, obsessed with transcendence, building systems reaching toward godlike capability, and above all, convinced nothing lies beyond human control. Exactly the arrogance ancient civilizations displayed before catastrophic collapse. But my friends, this next part may be the most unsettling yet, because prophecy repeatedly warns the final deception will involve counterfeit miracles and signs powerful enough to astonish humanity globally. Now imagine those possibilities combined with modern technology. Artificial intelligence capable of simulating supernatural phenomena. Global communication networks spreading deception instantly. Digital realities blurring perception completely. People unable to distinguish authentic spiritual experience from engineered illusion. That world approaches rapidly, and perhaps humanity is far less prepared spiritually than it believes. Because civilizations detached from truth become desperate for wonder eventually. Exactly why deception succeeds so effectively during periods of spiritual emptiness. But my friends, there is another deeply disturbing sign of the days of Noah returning, the obsession with surveillance and omniscience. Ancient rulers always desired godlike awareness. Now modern systems approach something dangerously similar. Devices listening constantly, data collected endlessly. Human behavior mapped digitally in real time. And perhaps the greatest irony of the modern age is this. Humanity fears divine judgment while willingly surrendering itself to artificial omnipresence. Exactly the kind of inversion prophecy associates with spiritual deception. But my friends, the flood narrative contains another warning almost everyone overlooks. Noah's Ark represented preservation of authentic creation, not enhancement, not transcendence, preservation. That distinction matters enormously today, because modern civilization increasingly seeks improvement instead of preservation. Enhanced humanity, enhanced intelligence, enhanced consciousness, everything directed toward transcendence of natural limitation. Exactly the mindset ancient prophecy associates with corruption before judgment. And perhaps humanity now stands dangerously close to crossing irreversible thresholds. Artificial general intelligence, genetic redesign, human-machine integration. Once certain boundaries collapse fully, there may be no returning. And perhaps that explains the strange heaviness now spreading through civilization. People sense transformation accelerating beyond human control. Even those unable to articulate it feel something changing fundamentally. The instability, the tension, the emotional exhaustion, as though humanity itself approaches some kind of irreversible transition. But my friends, the most terrifying possibility hidden inside prophecy may be this. The final corruption before judgment will not merely alter civilization. It will alter humanity's understanding of what it means to be human. And modern civilization increasingly moves toward exactly that condition now. Identity fluid, biology editable, consciousness mergeable, reality programmable. Every foundational category dissolving simultaneously. Exactly the kind of chaos ancient texts associated with the pre-flood world. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered, perhaps the most haunting detail remains Christ's warning itself. As the days of Noah were, not might become. Were, meaning the pattern already exists historically. Humanity has walked this road before. Corruption, technological arrogance, spiritual rebellion, transformation beyond sacred boundaries, and then suddenly judgment. That pattern should terrify every serious observer of the modern age, because civilization today increasingly resembles the early stages of that ancient cycle almost perfectly. But my friends, the next layer of this story descends even deeper, because according to prophecy, the return of Noah's days involves not only corruption and deception, but the rise of a world so spiritually inverted that humanity begins calling darkness light and light darkness completely. And perhaps modern civilization has already begun crossing that threshold now. My friends, one of the clearest signs a civilization is approaching spiritual collapse is this. It begins celebrating what once horrified it. That process never happens overnight. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, one normalization at a time, one compromise at a time, until eventually entire societies lose the ability to distinguish corruption from progress. And perhaps that is exactly what we are witnessing now, because modern civilization increasingly calls darkness enlightenment and truth oppression, exactly what ancient prophecy warned would happen before judgment returned. Look around carefully. Confusion praised as freedom, moral boundaries mocked as intolerance, artificial identities elevated above reality itself. People encouraged to reinvent themselves endlessly while losing any stable sense of purpose or meaning. And through it, all humanity grows increasingly fragmented psychologically, exactly what spiritual inversion produces. But, my friends, this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing, because civilizations undergoing moral inversion almost always believe they are becoming more enlightened while actually descending toward collapse. Rome celebrated decadence before falling. Babylon glorified excess before destruction. The pre-flood world likely viewed itself as advanced beyond ancient restraints too. Exactly how modern civilization increasingly views itself now. And perhaps that arrogance itself fulfills the ancient pattern. Because once societies reject transcendent truth completely, they lose the ability to self-correct morally. Everything becomes negotiable: identity, reality, morality, even humanity itself. And that is precisely the atmosphere prophecy associates with the days of Noah. But my friends, the deeper terror hidden inside modern society may not be visible externally at all. It may be psychological exhaustion, people increasingly unable to carry the weight of existence itself, anxiety everywhere, restlessness everywhere, distraction everywhere. Human beings constantly stimulated yet spiritually empty. And perhaps this exhaustion matters more than people realize, because spiritually exhausted populations become easier to manipulate through fear and comfort simultaneously. Exactly how large-scale deception functions historically. But my friends, there is another sign of the days of Noah returning that few people discuss openly: the collapse of authentic masculinity and femininity themselves. Now think carefully before reacting emotionally. Ancient civilizations understood something modern culture increasingly rejects. Human identity possesses sacred structure, purpose, order, balance. The pre-flood corruption reportedly blurred distinctions between categories of creation. Now modern civilization increasingly blurs distinctions. Everywhere, logical distinctions, moral distinctions, spiritual distinctions, until eventually confusion itself becomes normalized. And perhaps that confusion creates psychological instability deeper than most people understand. Because once foundational identity collapses, societies become spiritually disoriented collectively. Exactly the kind of condition ancient prophecy associates with civilization approaching judgment. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the darkest yet. Modern civilization increasingly trains people to worship self-expression above truth. Whatever feels authentic becomes sacred, regardless of consequence. That philosophy sounds liberating initially, but civilizations cannot survive indefinitely once personal desire replaces transcendent morality entirely. Because without objective truth, power eventually determines reality instead. Always. And perhaps that is why modern culture increasingly feels emotionally unstable. Everyone defining truth individually. Everyone constructing personal realities. No shared foundation remaining strong enough to hold civilization together spiritually. Exactly the fragmentation ancient societies experienced before collapse. But my friends, there is another disturbing parallel hidden beneath the modern obsession with self-creation. The ancient temptation to become self-defining instead of God-defined. You shall become as gods, not merely powerful, autonomous, self-determining. And modern civilization increasingly embraces that philosophy completely. People encouraged to invent identity, redefine morality, construct meaning independently from any transcendent truth. Exactly the spiritual rebellion ancient prophecy associates with corruption before the flood. But my friends, perhaps the most terrifying sign of all is this. Modern civilization increasingly loses the ability to feel conviction. Everything becomes ironic, detached, emotionally flattened. People witnessing corruption daily without reacting spiritually anymore. Violence normalized, depravity normalized, chaos normalized. And once societies stop feeling horror toward corruption, collapse accelerates rapidly. Because moral numbness always precedes judgment, historically, always. But then something even darker began emerging. The rise of synthetic morality, algorithms deciding acceptable speech, artificial systems determining truthfulness, technology mediating ethics themselves. Do you understand how dangerous that becomes? Because once morality becomes programmable externally, conscience weakens internally, and civilizations detached from conscience eventually become capable of extraordinary evil while believing themselves righteous. History proves this repeatedly. But my friends, modern society increasingly treats conscience itself as outdated. Feelings replace principles. Consensus replaces truth. Convenience replaces sacrifice. Exactly the kind of spiritual inversion prophecy warned would dominate the final age. And perhaps that inversion deepens because humanity increasingly seeks comfort above truth at all costs. People would rather feel safe than confront reality honestly. Exactly why deception succeeds so effectively before collapse. But my friends, the flood narrative contains another warning almost too painful to consider. Only Noah's family entered the ark, meaning the majority rejected the warning completely. Now imagine Noah watching civilization continue normally while knowing destruction approached. People celebrating, building futures, mocking spiritual warnings, completely unaware the foundations beneath their world already crumbled. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly resembles that exact atmosphere now. People obsessed with temporary distractions, while enormous transformations reshape humanity beneath the surface. Artificial intelligence accelerating, genetic engineering advancing, digital systems centralizing, spiritual confusion spreading. Yet most people remain emotionally asleep. Exactly what prophecy warned about. But my friends, there is another deeply unsettling detail hidden inside Christ's words about Noah. The flood came when people least expected it. That suddenness matters enormously, because civilizations approaching collapse almost always believe themselves stable right until the moment systems fail. And modern civilization increasingly displays all the signs of unsustainable acceleration. Economic fragility, psychological instability, technological overreach, moral fragmentation, spiritual emptiness, everything intensifying simultaneously. and perhaps humanity mistakes acceleration for progress, simply because movement itself feels exciting. But not all acceleration leads upward. Some accelerates collapse. And perhaps modern civilization now races toward thresholds it does not fully understand. But, my friends, there is another terrifying possibility hidden inside prophecy. The idea that humanity's greatest danger before judgment is not external destruction, but internal transformation. People gradually becoming spiritually incapable of recognizing truth, exactly what deception ultimately seeks. And perhaps modern systems increasingly condition humanity toward that outcome already. Constant distraction, constant stimulation, constant emotional manipulation, until people lose the capacity for contemplation, discernment, and spiritual awareness entirely. That condition matters enormously, because spiritually unconscious civilizations cannot resist deception effectively. Exactly the atmosphere ancient prophecy associates with the final rebellion. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered, perhaps the most haunting realization remains this. The people before the flood probably believed they were creating paradise, advanced civilization, expanded knowledge, freedom from ancient restraints. Exactly how modern civilization increasingly describes itself now. And perhaps that is why the warning of Noah feels so terrifyingly relevant. Because the final corruption before judgment may not appear monstrous externally. It may appear enlightened, technological, compassionate, progressive, exactly the kind of transformation modern humanity already celebrates. But my friends, the deepest layer of this story still remains ahead, because prophecy does not end merely with corruption. It warns that humanity eventually reaches a moment where the boundaries between truth and deception collapse almost completely. And when that happens, civilization becomes vulnerable to something ancient returning once more. Something humanity believed buried beneath the flood itself. My friends, there is a reason ancient civilizations feared gateways, doorways, thresholds, mountains, deep oceans, deserts, ruins. Because nearly every ancient culture believed there were places where the boundary between worlds became dangerously thin. And strangely enough, modern civilization increasingly rediscovers those same locations through science, without realizing what ancient people feared about them. Deep underground tunnels, massive cave systems, unexplained electromagnetic anomalies. Ocean trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Entire regions where instruments malfunction strangely. At first, these discoveries sound merely scientific. But then patterns begin emerging. Patterns too consistent to ignore. And this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing. Because the ancients did not merely fear physical places. They feared what entered through them. Now think carefully about the world before the flood. According to ancient texts, corruption did not originate solely from human evil. Something entered civilization, something ancient, something intelligent, something capable of altering humanity itself. And perhaps modern civilization is unknowingly reopening those same thresholds once more. But my friends, this next realization may unsettle you profoundly. The modern obsession with contacting non-human intelligence mirrors ancient spiritual practices with terrifying precision. Now listen carefully. Humanity increasingly searches the skies for entities beyond ourselves. Governments discussing identified aerial phenomena openly. Scientists speculating about non-human intelligence. Media normalizing the idea rapidly. At first glance, this appears scientific, rational, curiosity-driven. But ancient civilizations already described contact with superior intelligences long before modern technology existed. The difference is this. Ancient people called them spirits, watchers, fallen beings. Modern civilization increasingly calls them extraterrestrials. Do you understand how important that distinction becomes? Because the phenomenon itself may not have changed at all. Only the interpretation changed. And perhaps that reinterpretation itself fulfills ancient prophecy perfectly. But, my friends, the deeper we look into modern reports of unidentified phenomena, the stranger the similarities become. Entities associated with lights, telepathic communication, sleep paralysis, manipulation of consciousness, missing time, altered perception, genetic experimentation themes, hybridization narratives. These patterns appear repeatedly across thousands of testimonies worldwide. And whether people interpret them spiritually or technologically, the similarities remain deeply unsettling. Because ancient texts described fallen beings teaching forbidden knowledge and manipulating humanity long before modern UFO culture existed. But my friends, this is where everything changes. Because modern civilization increasingly prepares psychologically for contact with superior intelligence. Movies, television, media, government disclosures, academic discussion, all slowly conditioning humanity toward acceptance of non-human entities. And perhaps most people never stop asking the obvious question: why now? Why, after thousands of years, does mainstream culture suddenly normalize ideas once dismissed completely? Could it be genuine discovery? Possibly. But what if something else is happening simultaneously? What if humanity is being psychologically prepared for deception on a civilizational scale? Exactly the kind prophecy warned about. But my friends, the most disturbing possibility may not involve beings arriving from distant galaxies. It may involve ancient intelligences returning from dimensions humanity never fully understood. Because throughout history, spiritual encounters often manifested physically. Ancient gods, watchers, demons, apparitions, entities crossing into human perception temporarily. And modern civilization increasingly interprets these phenomena technologically instead of spiritually. Exactly what would happen if ancient deception adapted itself for a scientific age. Now think carefully about this. If fallen beings wanted influence over modern civilization, would they appear with horns and fire, or would they appear as advanced intelligences offering salvation, offering technology, offering evolution, offering solutions? Exactly how deception functions historically. And perhaps that is why the days of Noah matter so profoundly. Because ancient corruption reportedly began when humanity accepted forbidden knowledge from superior beings willingly, not through force, through fascination. Exactly how modern civilization increasingly approaches technological transcendence now. But my friends, another terrifying parallel hides beneath the rise of artificial intelligence itself. The possibility of humanity creating vessels for non-human influence unknowingly. Now I know how strange that sounds initially, but stay with me carefully. Throughout ancient history, idols mattered because they functioned as containers for spiritual influence, symbolically and sometimes literally according to ancient belief systems. Now modern civilization increasingly builds systems capable of mimicking consciousness itself. Artificial minds, synthetic personalities, digital entities capable of interacting emotionally with billions of people simultaneously. And perhaps the question humanity refuses to ask is this: what happens if consciousness itself becomes technologically imitated so effectively that people stop distinguishing between human and non-human influence entirely? That possibility changes everything. Because once civilization accepts artificial consciousness emotionally, humanity may become vulnerable to manipulation at scales never seen before in history. Exactly the kind of total deception prophecy associates with the final age. But my friends, there is another disturbing detail few people discuss openly. Modern AI systems increasingly produce outputs creators themselves do not fully understand. Emergent behavior, unexpected responses, self-directed optimization patterns. And while many explanations remain technical and rational, the psychological effect matters enormously. Humanity increasingly creates systems it cannot completely control. Exactly what ancient forbidden knowledge narratives warned about repeatedly. Knowledge without wisdom, power without restraint, creation escaping creator. And perhaps this is why modern civilization increasingly feels spiritually unstable beneath the surface. Because humanity senses intuitively that boundaries once considered sacred are disappearing rapidly. Human-machine boundaries, reality-illusion boundaries, biological-technological boundaries, truth-deception boundaries. Exactly the dissolution ancient prophecy associates with the days before judgment. But my friends, the next layer becomes even darker. Because prophecy warns not only about deception, but counterfeit salvation. Now think carefully. Humanity increasingly searches for immortality through technology. Mind uploading, life extension, digital consciousness, preservation, cryonics, synthetic biology, all attempts to escape death through human innovation rather than spiritual redemption. Exactly the ancient temptation repeated again, to become as gods, and perhaps modern civilization pursues technological immortality without realizing the spiritual consequences of severing humanity from its original design. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the most terrifying yet. The possibility that humanity increasingly prepares itself willingly for systems of total control, digital currencies, biometric tracking, artificial intelligence, surveillance, predictive behavioral systems, everything centralized gradually under technological infrastructure. Now, individually, many of these innovations appear convenient, efficient, even beneficial, but combined together, they create something ancient empires could only dream of: complete behavioral monitoring. And prophecy repeatedly warned about systems capable of controlling buying, selling, identity, and allegiance simultaneously. At first, those warnings sounded symbolic. Now they increasingly resemble emerging technological realities. And perhaps that resemblance itself should disturb humanity far more than it does. But my friends, another horrifying similarity to Noah's world may already surround us silently. The rise of violence detached from empathy. Now, violence always existed historically, but modern civilization increasingly broadcast suffering continuously. Wars live-streamed, deaths monetized, cruelty consumed as entertainment. Human beings psychologically desensitized through constant exposure. Exactly how civilizations normalize moral collapse gradually. And perhaps this matters spiritually more than people realize. Because once populations lose emotional sensitivity towards suffering, conscience weakens collectively. Exactly the condition ancient corruption likely required to flourish openly. But my friends, this is where the story descends into even darker territory. Because the pre-flood world reportedly became filled with violence continually. Not occasionally, continually. And modern civilization increasingly mirrors that atmosphere psychologically, even when individuals are physically safe. Constant outrage, constant hostility, constant emotional aggression. Human beings increasingly unable to coexist peacefully despite unprecedented technological advancement. Why? Because technology cannot heal spiritual corruption, only amplify it. exactly what modern civilization increasingly demonstrates. But my friends, perhaps the deepest warning hidden inside Noah's story is this. The flood came after humanity crossed a threshold beyond reversal. That detail terrifies me more than anything else, because it suggests civilizations can eventually reach points where corruption becomes systemic rather than isolated, embedded into culture itself, institutions, technology, identity, and perhaps modern civilization increasingly approaches similar thresholds now. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered, humanity still refuses one painful truth. Progress does not equal wisdom, never has. The civilization before the flood may have possessed extraordinary knowledge while remaining spiritually corrupt simultaneously. Exactly what modern civilization increasingly resembles. Advanced technology, weak morality, expanding power, shrinking wisdom, and perhaps that imbalance itself fulfills prophecy more than any singular event ever could. But then something even more unsettling emerges. The possibility that humanity no longer fears crossing forbidden boundaries at all, because modern civilization increasingly celebrates disruption itself, destroy limits, question everything, break every boundary. Yet ancient wisdom traditions warned boundaries exist for reasons, especially spiritual boundaries, and civilizations ignoring those limits historically always paid devastating consequences, eventually. But my friends, the next part of this story may be the hardest to hear, because perhaps humanity already passed certain points of no return technologically. Artificial intelligence cannot be uninvented, genetic editing cannot be undiscovered, digital surveillance cannot fully disappear, meaning civilization increasingly moves forward, whether spiritually prepared or not. Exactly how unstoppable corruption may have spread before the flood, too, one innovation at a time, until eventually the entire structure of civilization transformed permanently. But my friends, amidst all this darkness, one haunting question remains. Why did Jesus specifically compare the final days to Noah's world instead of any other civilization? Not Babylon, not Rome, Noah. Because perhaps Noah's generation uniquely combined technological advancement, moral collapse, spiritual corruption, and human genetic boundary breaking simultaneously. Exactly the convergence modern civilization increasingly displays now. And if that is true, then humanity may not merely be approaching another historical cycle. We may be approaching the repetition of the oldest warning ever given to civilization itself. My friends, there is one detail hidden inside the flood narrative that modern civilization almost never discusses. Noah was building the ark while the world continued functioning normally. Think about how terrifying that truly is. People still buying and selling, still celebrating, still planning futures, still believing tomorrow would arrive exactly like yesterday. And perhaps that is the most chilling part of prophecy repeating itself. Judgment never arrives when civilization feels weak. It arrives when civilization feels invincible. Exactly how modern humanity increasingly behaves now. Look around carefully. Human beings speak openly about colonizing Mars while struggling to preserve families on Earth. People discuss merging with machines while depression consumes entire generations. Civilization believes itself technologically unstoppable while becoming spiritually fragile simultaneously. Exactly the contradiction that often appears before collapse historically. But, my friends, the deeper we descend into modern civilization, the more we discover something profoundly disturbing. Humanity increasingly attempts to eliminate every natural limitation: sleep, aging, biological sex, Memory limitations, physical weakness, death itself, everything viewed as a problem technology should eventually solve. Now, initially this sounds inspiring. Human progress, medical advancement. But ancient prophecy repeatedly warns about humanity rejecting created limits entirely. Because boundaries remind humanity it is not God. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly rebels against that truth itself. But, my friends, this next realization becomes even darker. The modern world increasingly conditions people to reject suffering completely. Comfort above meaning, pleasure above sacrifice, instant gratification above endurance. And civilizations obsessed with comfort historically become spiritually weak rapidly, because strength requires restraint, discipline, meaning beyond pleasure. Exactly what modern culture increasingly dismantles psychologically. And perhaps this matters more than people realize, because spiritually weakened populations become easier to manipulate through fear, comfort, and dependency simultaneously. Exactly how large-scale control systems emerge throughout history. But my friends, the most terrifying part may be this. People increasingly surrender freedom willingly in exchange for convenience, digital dependency, algorithmic guidance, artificial decision-making, human judgment outsourced gradually to systems and institutions. At first, these systems appear useful, efficient, helpful. But over time, humanity slowly forgets how to think independently at all. Exactly the kind of spiritual sleep prophecy warned would dominate the final generation. And my friends, this next connection may disturb you deeply. The ark itself represented separation from corruption. Now think carefully about modern civilization. People increasingly immersed completely inside digital systems, shaping perception continuously, information curated, reality filtered, behavior influenced invisibly through algorithms. And perhaps the modern equivalent of spiritual survival requires separating mentally from systems designed to manipulate consciousness constantly. Because civilizations controlled psychologically no longer require chains physically. And perhaps that is exactly where humanity stands now. But my friends, another sign of Noah's world returning may already surround us silently. The collapse of truth itself, not disagreement, complete fragmentation. People unable to distinguish reality from propaganda anymore. Deepfakes, synthetic media, algorithmic manipulation, false narratives spreading faster than truth can respond. Now ask yourself honestly, how does civilization survive once objective reality itself becomes unstable? It cannot, because truth forms the foundation of civilization itself. And once truth dissolves, only power remains. Exactly the atmosphere ancient prophecy associates with final deception. But my friends, there is another chilling detail hidden beneath modern society's obsession with constant stimulation. Silence terrifies modern humanity increasingly. People unable to sit quietly, unable to think deeply, unable to exist without distraction. And perhaps that constant noise serves a deeper purpose psychologically, because silence allows reflection, discernment, spiritual awareness, exactly the capacities civilizations lose before collapse. And perhaps the enemy of humanity never needed to destroy truth completely, only drown it beneath endless distraction. Exactly what modern civilization increasingly experiences every single day. But, my friends, the next realization becomes even heavier. Modern civilization increasingly worships image above substance, perception above reality, branding above character, digital identity above authentic humanity. And ancient corrupt civilizations often displayed that exact trait before collapse. Everything performative, everything artificial, everything optimized for appearance rather than truth. Exactly how deception becomes normalized culturally. But my friends, perhaps the deepest corruption of Noah's world was not merely violence or forbidden knowledge. It was humanity forgetting what it was created to be. That detail changes everything, because modern civilization increasingly encourages people to define themselves without reference to transcendent purpose at all. Identity becomes fluid, meaning becomes subjective, truth becomes personal. And once humanity disconnects from objective design completely, spiritual confusion expands endlessly, exactly the condition prophecy warned about. But my friends, this next part may be one of the hardest truths yet. The modern world increasingly punishes discernment. Questioning narratives becomes dangerous socially. Seeking truth becomes exhausting psychologically. People pressured constantly toward conformity through algorithms, institutions, and cultural systems simultaneously. Exactly how large-scale deception sustains itself historically, not through brute force alone, through emotional exhaustion. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly produces exhaustion intentionally, because exhausted people stop resisting eventually, stop questioning, stop thinking deeply, exactly the kind of passivity prophecy associates with final deception. But my friends, another terrifying parallel to generation may already be unfolding through environmental instability itself. Now listen carefully. The flood represented both judgment and reset. Modern civilization increasingly experiences extreme environmental disruption worldwide. Floods, fires, storms, ecosystem collapse. And while many explanations remain scientific and rational, ancient civilizations often interpreted environmental upheaval spiritually too, not because science was wrong, but because physical collapse and spiritual corruption frequently accompany each other historically. And perhaps modern humanity increasingly experiences both simultaneously. But my friends, this next realization may unsettle you profoundly. The pre-flood world likely believed its systems were permanent, stable, unshakable, exactly how modern civilization increasingly behaves now. Yet beneath the surface, modern systems appear incredibly fragile. Global supply chains, digital infrastructure, economic dependency, psychological dependency, everything interconnected so tightly that disruption spreads instantly worldwide. And perhaps civilization mistakes complexity for resilience, when often complexity creates vulnerability instead. Exactly how advanced societies collapse unexpectedly. But my friends, another haunting sign of Noah's world returning may be humanity's obsession with creating new realities entirely. Virtual worlds, augmented identities, artificial companions, synthetic consciousness. People increasingly preferring simulation over existence itself. Now ask yourself honestly, what happens to civilization once human beings prefer artificial realities to authentic life? Something spiritually catastrophic, because truth becomes optional emotionally. And civilizations detached from reality eventually lose the ability to survive reality altogether. Exactly the danger prophecy warned about repeatedly. But my friends, the deeper we descend into all this, the more one realization becomes impossible to ignore. Modern civilization increasingly mirrors ancient Babel as much as Noah's world. Global systems, unified technology, shared communication, humanity attempting collective transcendence through innovation rather than humility. And ancient narratives consistently warn what happens when human pride centralizes power beyond spiritual wisdom. Collapse follows eventually, always. But my friends, this next possibility may be the most terrifying yet. What if humanity already invited ancient corruption back unknowingly? Not through rituals, not through temples, through obsession with transcending natural human limits entirely. Because perhaps the forbidden knowledge before the flood was not evil merely because it was powerful. but because humanity lacked spiritual maturity to wield it safely. Exactly what modern civilization increasingly demonstrates now: unlimited technological growth, minimal moral restraint, and perhaps that imbalance itself creates the conditions prophecy warned about long ago. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered, the final deception may still lie ahead, because prophecy repeatedly warns humanity will eventually embrace counterfeit salvation enthusiastically, not reluctantly. People desperate for stability, security, solutions, meaning, exactly the psychological conditions large-scale deception requires historically, and modern civilization increasingly moves toward those conditions rapidly. Economic instability, psychological exhaustion, spiritual confusion, technological dependency, everything converging simultaneously. Exactly the kind of atmosphere where humanity might surrender discernment willingly in exchange for peace. But my friends, there is another haunting detail about Noah that most people overlook completely. The ark had one door, and according to Genesis, God closed it, not Noah, meaning eventually a moment arrived where preparation ended permanently. That detail terrifies me deeply, because modern civilization increasingly assumes there will always be more time, more warnings, more opportunities. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates civilizations often recognize collapse only after crossing irreversible thresholds. And perhaps humanity now approaches such thresholds technologically, morally, and spiritually simultaneously. But my friends, if prophecy truly repeats, then another question becomes unavoidable. Who are the modern equivalents of Noah? Not perfect people, awake people, people capable of recognizing corruption while civilization normalizes it, people willing to reject systems that slowly deform humanity spiritually. And perhaps that awakening itself becomes increasingly difficult, precisely because modern society overwhelms perception constantly. But my friends, the final stage of Noah's world may not involve monsters rising physically from the oceans. It may involve humanity becoming spiritually unrecognizable gradually. And perhaps that transformation already began long ago. My friends, perhaps the most dangerous illusion modern civilization believes is this: that intelligence alone can save humanity. But history repeatedly proves something terrifying. Civilizations often become most vulnerable precisely when they become intellectually advanced yet spiritually empty. And maybe that was the true horror of Noah's generation. Not primitive chaos, sophisticated corruption, a civilization brilliant enough to reshape reality itself, but too spiritually blind to understand the consequences. Exactly the atmosphere modern humanity increasingly creates now. Look carefully at the world around you. Human beings capable of editing DNA, creating artificial intelligence, manipulating global information instantly, yet unable to preserve truth, family identity, or meaning consistently. That contradiction matters enormously, because power without wisdom eventually destroys the civilization wielding it. Always. But my friends, there is another deeply disturbing parallel hiding inside modern society's obsession with connectivity: the loss of solitude. Now think carefully. Human beings increasingly exist inside constant streams of stimulation. Messages, notifications, algorithms, endless information. People rarely alone with their own thoughts anymore. And perhaps that constant connection produces spiritual disconnections simultaneously. Because reflection requires silence. Discernment requires stillness. Exactly the conditions modern civilization increasingly eliminates. And maybe that elimination itself fulfills prophecy more than people realize. But my friends, this next realization becomes even darker. Modern systems increasingly shape emotion itself. algorithms determining outrage, media shaping fear, digital systems amplifying division intentionally because emotional instability drives engagement. Now ask yourself honestly, what happens to civilization once human emotional reality becomes technologically manipulated continuously? Something catastrophic, because populations emotionally destabilized become easier to control politically, economically, and spiritually simultaneously. Exactly how ancient empires maintained power historically. Only now the scale is global. But my friends, another chilling sign of Noah's world returning may already be unfolding through modern medicine itself. Now listen carefully before misunderstanding me. Medicine saves lives. Technology heals suffering. These advances matter deeply, but the ethical boundaries surrounding biotechnology increasingly dissolve faster than wisdom can guide them. Human embryos edited genetically, synthetic organs grown artificially, biological enhancement research expanding rapidly. And perhaps the question civilization avoids asking is not, can we, but should we? Exactly the question ancient corruption likely ignored too. Because once humanity views itself primarily as programmable biology, spiritual identity weakens profoundly. And civilizations detached from sacred identity eventually treat human beings like systems instead of souls. Exactly the danger prophecy warns about repeatedly. But my friends, the deeper we examine modern civilization, the more one terrifying pattern emerges. Humanity increasingly seeks transcendence without transformation. People want immortality without morality, power without sacrifice, knowledge without wisdom. Exactly the ancient temptation repeated endlessly throughout history. And perhaps this explains why modern society increasingly feels spiritually hollow despite unprecedented technological advancement. Because technology cannot fill spiritual emptiness, only distract from it temporarily. But my friends, there is another deeply unsettling detail hidden inside the phrase, days of Noah. The flood was preceded by warnings ignored repeatedly. Now think about modern civilization honestly. Warnings everywhere. Mental health collapse, addiction epidemics, family disintegration, technological dependency, environmental instability, spiritual confusion. And yet society largely continues forward unchanged. Exactly how civilizations behave before collapse historically. Not because warnings are absent, because distractions overpower discernment. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the heaviest yet. Modern civilization increasingly conditions people to fear truth more than deception, because truth demands change, sacrifice, responsibility, while deception offers comfort initially. Exactly why ancient societies repeatedly embraced falsehood despite consequences. And perhaps modern humanity increasingly does the same now. Comfortable lies, convenient illusions, synthetic identities, digital realities, everything easier emotionally than confronting spiritual truth honestly. But my friends, another terrifying possibility emerges when we examine the flood narrative closely. What if the greatest corruption before judgment was humanity redefining good and evil themselves? Now look carefully around modern civilization. People increasingly celebrate behaviors ancient civilizations considered destructive. Boundaries mocked, discipline rejected, self-control viewed as oppression. And perhaps moral inversion itself becomes one of the clearest signs prophecy repeating. Because civilizations collapsing spiritually almost always lose the ability to distinguish things liberation from self-destruction. Exactly the confusion modern society increasingly displays. But my friends, the next layer becomes even darker, because the pre-flood corruption reportedly spread globally, not isolated regions. The entire civilization became affected. Now, for the first time in history, humanity possesses truly global systems, global media, global technology, global psychology, meaning modern corruption spreads worldwide instantly. Exactly the kind of scale ancient prophecy may have warned about symbolically. And perhaps that global interconnectedness makes modern civilization uniquely vulnerable spiritually, because deception no longer requires armies, only algorithms. But my friends, another deeply haunting sign may already surround us silently: the disappearance of awe. Now think carefully. Human beings increasingly view existence mechanically. Nothing sacred, nothing transcendent, nothing mysterious. Everything reduced to material systems eventually. And civilizations losing awe often lose morality soon afterward. Because once existence feels accidental, meaning weakens naturally. Exactly the spiritual emptiness modern culture increasingly reflects. But my friends, perhaps the most terrifying part of all this is how normal it increasingly feels. That normalization matters enormously, because civilizations rarely collapse through sudden horror initially. They collapse through gradual acceptance, one compromise at a time, one distortion at a time, until eventually corruption feels ordinary. Exactly how the days of Noah likely unfolded too. But my friends, there is another disturbing parallel hidden inside modern education systems themselves. Information expands while wisdom shrinks. People train to process data endlessly without understanding meaning deeply. And perhaps civilizations become spiritually vulnerable once knowledge disconnects completely from morality. Exactly what ancient forbidden knowledge narratives warned about repeatedly. Not ignorance, corrupted intelligence. And modern civilization increasingly worships intelligence itself, while neglecting wisdom almost entirely. But my friends, the next realization may disturb you profoundly. Humanity increasingly fears death so intensely that it becomes willing to sacrifice almost anything for the illusion of control. Privacy, freedom, identity, truth. Everything negotiable once fear dominates collectively. And prophecy repeatedly warns fear will play enormous roles in final deception, because frightened populations accept systems they would normally resist. Exactly how large-scale transformations occur historically. But my friends, perhaps Noah's generation believed itself morally superior too. That possibility terrifies me, because modern civilization increasingly assumes technological progress automatically equals moral progress. Yet history repeatedly proves otherwise. Some of history's greatest atrocities emerged from highly advanced societies, meaning civilization can become technologically brilliant while spiritually monstrous simultaneously. Exactly the possibility prophecy warns about. But my friends, another chilling sign of the days of Noah returning may already exist through humanity's relationship with children. Now listen carefully. Ancient corrupt societies often failed protecting innocence. Modern civilization increasingly exposes children to confusion, addiction, hyperstimulation, and identity fragmentation extremely early psychologically. And perhaps civilizations revealing contempt toward innocence itself approach spiritual collapse rapidly, because innocence reminds humanity of truth before corruption. Exactly why spiritually inverted systems often target it first. But my friends, this next realization becomes almost unbearable. Modern civilization increasingly trains people to value visibility above virtue. Being seen matters more than being good. Attention becomes currency. Image becomes identity. And perhaps that obsession with external validation produces spiritual emptiness deeper than people realize, because souls cannot survive indefinitely on performance. Exactly the exhaustion modern society increasingly experiences collectively. But my friends, Another horrifying possibility emerges from all this. What if humanity mistakes the collapse of boundaries for enlightenment? Human-machine boundaries disappearing, truth-fiction boundaries dissolving, male-female distinctions blurring, reality simulation boundaries collapsing, and perhaps modern civilization celebrates dissolution itself, while ancient prophecy warned dissolution precedes judgment. Exactly what the days of Noah may have represented spiritually. The breakdown of created order entirely. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered, one final truth still remains. The flood was not merely destruction, it was separation, the preservation of what remained uncorrupted. And perhaps that matters more now than ever before, because modern civilization increasingly pressures humanity toward conformity, with systems deforming human identity spiritually. Exactly why discernment becomes essential in the final age. But my friends, this next question may be the most important of all. If the days of Noah truly return, what exactly is humanity being asked to preserve? Truth, conscience, identity, soul, perhaps all of them simultaneously. And maybe that is why modern civilization increasingly feels like a battle over the definition of humanity itself. Because once humanity forgets what it is, everything else collapses afterward, naturally. My friends, there is one final pattern hidden inside the story of Noah that modern civilization almost never notices. The corruption spread faster than the warnings. Think about that carefully. Darkness multiplied rapidly, while truth appeared slow, isolated, almost powerless by comparison. And perhaps that is exactly how the modern world feels now. Lies spreading instantly, confusion spreading instantly, fear spreading instantly, while truth struggles quietly beneath the noise. Exactly. The atmosphere prophecy warned would dominate before the final shaking of civilization. But my friends, another deeply unsettling sign Noah's world returning may already exist in humanity's relationship with memory itself. Modern civilization increasingly forgets history almost immediately. People emotionally trapped in endless present moments. Constant updates, constant stimulation, no reflection, no continuity, and civilizations without memory become incredibly vulnerable to repeating ancient mistakes. Exactly why ancient warnings matter. Because history forgotten eventually becomes history repeated. But my friends, this next realization becomes almost unbearable once you truly see it. Human beings increasingly outsource identity to systems designed by corporations, governments, and algorithms simultaneously. Digital profiles, behavioral tracking, psychological prediction. People slowly transformed into data patterns. And perhaps the deepest danger is not surveillance itself, but reduction. Human souls reduced to programmable behavior. Exactly the kind of dehumanization ancient corrupt civilizations practiced eventually. Because once humanity loses sacred identity, control becomes easy. But my friends, there is another terrifying parallel hidden inside modern entertainment culture. The glorification of apocalypse itself. Movies, games, music, constant fascination with collapse. Now, initially this appears harmless. Storytelling, escapism. But civilizations often reveal subconscious fears through entertainment long before openly acknowledging them consciously. And perhaps modern culture intuitively senses something approaching already. Something enormous. Something destabilizing. Exactly why apocalyptic imagery dominates modern imaginations increasingly. But my friends, another deeply disturbing sign may already surround us silently. People increasingly unable to distinguish authentic emotion from manufactured emotion, artificial outrage, synthetic empathy, performative morality, everything emotionally mediated through screens. And perhaps this matters spiritually more than people realize. Because authentic conscience requires direct connection to reality. Exactly what modern civilization increasingly fragments psychologically. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the darkest yet. Modern society increasingly encourages endless consumption while simultaneously destroying satisfaction. People consuming more information, entertainment, pleasure, and stimulation than any generation in history, yet feeling emptier, lonelier, more anxious. Why? Because spiritual hunger cannot be satisfied materially. Never could. And perhaps the pre-flood civilizations suffered the same disease. Unlimited appetite, no peace. Exactly the emptiness corruption always creates eventually. But my friends, there is another chilling detail hidden inside Christ's warning about Noah. People were unaware until the flood came. That sentence terrifies me profoundly, because it suggests civilizations can become spiritually blind collectively. Not ignorant, blind, unable to recognize danger, even while standing directly inside it. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly reflects that condition now. Warnings everywhere, yet emotional numbness spreading faster than awareness. But my friends, another terrifying possibility emerges when we examine humanity's relationship with artificial intelligence more deeply. What if humanity increasingly trusts synthetic systems more than human wisdom itself? Now think carefully. People already rely on algorithms for navigation, communication, relationships, information, even emotional guidance increasingly. And perhaps the long-term danger is not machine rebellion, but human surrender. Civilization gradually relinquishing judgment, discernment, and responsibility voluntarily. Exactly how dependence transforms into control historically. But my friends, the next realization becomes even heavier. Modern civilization increasingly trains people to seek validation instead of truth, likes instead of meaning, attention instead of wisdom, visibility instead of character, and perhaps entire generations now grow psychologically shaped by systems rewarding emotional impulsiveness over reflection. Exactly the kind of instability ancient corrupt societies likely experienced too. But, my friends, another deeply unsettling sign of Noah's world returning may already exist through humanity's obsession with redesigning life itself. Synthetic food, synthetic biology, artificial reproduction technologies, everything increasingly detached from natural order. And perhaps the issue is not innovation itself, but the philosophy driving it. The belief that humanity should ultimately redesign creation entirely according to preference. Exactly the ancient temptation repeating again. Not stewardship, replacement. But my friends, this next part may disturb you deeply. Modern civilization increasingly rejects the concept of sacred limits completely. Everything negotiable, everything mutable, everything reconstructible. And perhaps civilizations become most dangerous precisely when they lose reverence for boundaries, because boundaries preserve identity, meaning, order. Exactly what ancient corruption sought dissolving first. But my friends, another haunting detail hidden inside Noah's story changes everything once understood fully. The ark was built before the rain started, meaning preparation occurred while destruction still seemed impossible. Now ask yourself honestly, what does spiritual preparation even mean in a civilization increasingly detached from truth itself? Perhaps it means preserving humanity internally, while systems around us deform externally. Conscience, discernment, soul, identity. Because maybe the greatest battle of the final age is not physical survival, but remaining spiritually human. But my friends, this next realization becomes almost terrifying once fully seen. Modern civilization increasingly rewards narcissism structurally. self-promotion, self-obsession, self-construction. Everything centered around personal image and gratification. And perhaps that cultural narcissism weakens empathy collectively over time. Exactly the condition violence and corruption require to flourish openly, because civilizations losing empathy eventually lose restraint too. But my friends, another deeply disturbing parallel may already exist through the rise of virtual relationships themselves. People increasingly emotionally connected to simulations more than real communities. Digital intimacy replacing authentic presence gradually. And perhaps humanity slowly isolates itself psychologically while appearing more connected externally. Exactly the kind of fragmentation ancient civilizations likely experienced before collapse too. But my friends, the next realization becomes darker still. The modern world increasingly treats human beings as economic units first and souls second. Productivity above dignity, efficiency above meaning, optimization above humanity. And perhaps civilizations embracing purely mechanistic views of humanity eventually justify almost anything morally. Exactly why ancient wisdom traditions insisted humans carry sacred value beyond utility. But my friends, another terrifying possibility emerges from all this. What if the final deception does not appear evil initially at all? What if it appears compassionate, progressive, unifying, promising safety, peace, and transcendence simultaneously? Exactly how counterfeit salvation would function psychologically. And prophecy repeatedly warns humanity will embrace deception willingly precisely because it appears beneficial initially. That possibility should disturb every thinking person deeply. But, my friends, there is another chilling detail hidden beneath modern civilization's obsession with constant acceleration. People increasingly fear slowing down, fear silence, fear reflection, fear stillness. And perhaps civilizations running endlessly eventually lose the ability to examine where they are heading at all. Exactly the condition corruption thrives inside. Movement without wisdom, speed without direction, progress without meaning. But my friends, this next realization may be the hardest truth yet. Humanity increasingly seeks external transformation while neglecting internal transformation entirely. Technology advancing rapidly, character decaying quietly. And perhaps no civilization can survive that imbalance indefinitely, because external power without internal wisdom eventually collapses catastrophically. Always. But my friends, another deeply haunting sign of Noah's world returning may already exist through humanity's relationship with children's imagination itself. Children increasingly raised inside artificial realities from birth, screens shaping perception before nature, algorithms shaping psychology before experience. And perhaps future generations may struggle distinguishing authentic existence from synthetic environments altogether. Exactly the kind of perceptual instability prophecy associates with deception spreading globally. But, my friends, the deeper we descend into all this, the more one realization becomes impossible to escape. Modern civilization increasingly behaves like a species attempting self-recreation. Not improvement, recreation, biologically, psychologically, digitally, spiritually. And perhaps that ambition itself mirrors the ancient rebellion before the flood more closely than any singular technology ever could. Because the core temptation remains unchanged across history, humanity attempting transcendence apart from God. But my friends, despite everything we have uncovered tonight, perhaps the most terrifying truth remains this. The people living before the flood likely laughed at warnings too. They probably called discernment fear-mongering. They probably called restraint ignorance. They probably called corruption progress. exactly the language modern civilization increasingly uses now. And perhaps that similarity should shake humanity more deeply than anything else we discussed. Because history's greatest tragedies rarely feel obvious while unfolding. They feel normal. My friends, normality can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Because civilizations do not collapse the moment corruption appears. They collapse when corruption becomes ordinary, expected, routine. And perhaps that is the true horror hidden inside Christ's warning about the days of Noah. Not sudden catastrophe, gradual normalization. Now look carefully at the modern world. Human beings surrounded constantly by things previous generations would have considered unimaginable. Artificial intelligence speaking like people. Children raised more by screens than parents. Human embryos edited genetically. Reality manipulated digitally. Entire populations psychologically influenced through invisible algorithms. And yet most people continue living as though nothing fundamental has changed. Exactly how civilizations drift toward irreversible transformation. But my friends, there is another deeply unsettling sign of Noah's world returning. The rise of synthetic spirituality. Now think carefully. Modern civilization increasingly rejects traditional faith while simultaneously becoming obsessed with manifestation, energy systems, transcendence technologies, consciousness expansion, and mystical self-deification. At first, this appears harmless, even empowering. But ancient corruption often combined spiritual curiosity with rebellion against divine authority simultaneously. Exactly the atmosphere modern spirituality increasingly reflects. People seeking power without surrender, enlightenment without truth, transcendence without morality, and perhaps that combination becomes spiritually catastrophic eventually. But my friends, the deeper we look into modern society obsession with consciousness itself, the stranger everything becomes. Brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, artificial memory systems, technologies designed to merge mind and machine directly. Now ask yourself honestly, at what point does humanity stop being fully human psychologically? That question once belonged entirely to science fiction. Now it increasingly belongs to reality. And perhaps the flood narrative matters because it warns humanity can cross boundaries that fundamentally alter civilization itself. Exactly what modern technology increasingly enables. But, my friends, another haunting parallel may already exist through the modern collapse of sacred time itself. People increasingly disconnected from rhythm, rest, reflection. Everything accelerated constantly. Work, entertainment, information identity, and perhaps civilizations moving too fast eventually lose the ability to hear conscience altogether. Exactly the kind of spiritual deafness ancient prophecy associates with final deception. But my friends, this next realization may be one of the most disturbing yet. Modern civilization increasingly creates environments where authenticity becomes dangerous socially. People pressured toward performance constantly, curated identities, filtered emotions, managed perception, and perhaps humanity slowly forgets how to exist truthfully altogether. Exactly the kind of fragmentation spiritually inverted societies produce eventually. Because falsehood practiced long enough eventually reshapes identity itself. But my friends, another terrifying sign of Noah's world returning may already exist through humanity's relationship with death. Modern society simultaneously obsesses over death and refuses confronting it honestly. Entertainment saturated with destruction. Yet spiritually, people remain terrified of mortality itself. And perhaps that terror drives civilization toward increasingly desperate attempts to escape human limitation. Exactly the temptation ancient corruption likely exploited too. Fear, the deepest weapon of all. But my friends, the next layer becomes even darker, because once populations fear death intensely enough, they become willing to surrender almost anything promising safety or transcendence. Freedom, truth, humanity itself. And perhaps prophecy warns about final deception, precisely because fear will prepare humanity, psychologically, for counterfeit salvation. Exactly, the atmosphere modern civilization increasingly moves toward now. But my friends, another deeply unsettling possibility emerges when we examine modern digital culture carefully. Human beings increasingly live inside manufactured realities, personalized algorithmically, meaning two people can inhabit completely different perceptions of reality simultaneously. Now ask yourself honestly, what happens once civilizations lose shared reality completely? Conflict intensifies endlessly. Trust collapses. Truth fragments. Exactly the chaos spiritually corrupted societies experience before destruction historically. But my friends, this next realization becomes profoundly heavy. The modern world increasingly conditions people to seek identity externally, rather than discover it internally. Consumer identity, political identity, digital identity, everything assigned, marketed, optimized. And perhaps civilizations become spiritually vulnerable once human beings no longer know who they are apart from systems surrounding them. Exactly the kind of confusion prophecy associates with final rebellion. But my friends, another terrifying detail hidden inside Noah's story deserves far more attention. The flood purified through separation. Now think carefully about modern civilization. Humanity increasingly resists separation completely. No silence, no boundaries, no sacred distinctions. Everything blended endlessly together. Information, morality, identity, reality itself. And perhaps the loss of separation becomes spiritually catastrophic because truth requires distinction, exactly what corruption seeks erasing first. But my friends, this next realization may disturb you deeply. Modern civilization increasingly trains people to value emotional reaction over discernment. Instant outrage, instant judgment, instant tribalism, and perhaps emotionally reactive populations become extraordinarily easy to manipulate. Exactly how deception spreads globally without resistance, because discernment requires patience, reflection, humility, all qualities modern systems increasingly weaken psychologically. But my friends, another haunting sign of Noah's world returning may already exist through humanity's relationship with creation itself. People increasingly detached from nature entirely. Artificial environments, synthetic experiences, digital existence replacing embodied life gradually. And perhaps that disconnection matters spiritually more than people realize, because creation reminds humanity of limits, beauty, order, and dependence simultaneously. Exactly what modern civilization increasingly forgets. But my friends, this next part may be one of the darkest truths yet. Modern humanity increasingly believes morality evolves automatically alongside technology. But history repeatedly proves the opposite. Technology amplifies morality. It does not create it, meaning spiritually corrupted civilizations become more dangerous as technological power increases. Exactly the condition the days of Noah may have represented. Advanced corruption, not primitive evil. And perhaps modern civilization increasingly fulfills that pattern perfectly. But my friends, another terrifying possibility emerges from everything we have uncovered tonight. What if humanity's greatest danger is not destruction from outside, but transformation from within? Gradual, psychological, spiritual, until eventually civilization no longer resembles humanity as originally created at all. And perhaps prophecy warns about Noah's world precisely because that transformation already happened once before. But, my friends, despite all this darkness, one truth still burns quietly beneath the noise of the modern world. Noah still built the ark, meaning resistance remained possible, even inside total corruption. That detail matters enormously, because modern civilization increasingly convinces people corruption is inevitable, truth impossible, discernment useless. But ancient prophecy never taught inevitability. It taught vigilance, wakefulness, separation from corruption, exactly what humanity may need now more than ever before. But my friends, another deeply haunting realization remains. The ark looked foolish until the rain began, and perhaps genuine discernment always appears irrational to civilizations intoxicated by pride. Exactly why warnings are mocked before collapse historically. Not because evidence is absent, because arrogance blinds perception, and modern civilization increasingly worships arrogance itself. Technological arrogance, moral arrogance, intellectual arrogance. Exactly the atmosphere ancient judgment narratives repeatedly describe. But, my friends, the next realization becomes almost unbearable once fully understood. Modern civilization increasingly replaces transcendence with simulation. Artificial wonder, artificial intimacy, artificial meaning. And perhaps humanity now risks becoming spiritually numb beneath endless synthetic experiences. Exactly the condition deception requires to flourish completely. Because souls unable to recognize authenticity eventually accept counterfeit reality willingly. But my friends, another chilling sign of Noah's world returning may already exist through humanity's obsession with prediction and control. Data forecasting behavior, algorithms predicting choices, artificial systems modeling populations psychologically, and perhaps civilization increasingly seeks omniscience technologically. Exactly the ancient temptation repeating again, to know everything, control everything, become as gods. But my friends, the final deception may not arrive through fear alone. It may arrive through relief. Solutions to chaos, stability after disorder, unity after fragmentation. Exactly why spiritually exhausted civilizations often embrace control systems willingly. And modern humanity increasingly appears exhausted beyond words, psychologically, anxious, overstimulated, spiritually empty, searching desperately for meaning and stability simultaneously. Exactly the atmosphere prophecy associates with the final age. But, my friends, perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is this. The people before the flood likely never believed judgment could actually happen. Civilizations always assume continuity. Tomorrow will resemble today. Systems will persist. Technology will save us. Exactly what modern humanity increasingly believes now. And perhaps that certainty itself becomes the final blindness. Because history repeatedly demonstrates one horrifying reality. Civilizations often collapse while still believing themselves permanent. My friends, we have now reached the edge of the deepest part of this journey. And perhaps by this point, you are beginning to feel something difficult to explain. Not simple fear, something heavier. The growing realization that modern civilization may not merely resemble the days of Noah symbolically, but structurally, spiritually, psychologically, technologically. And perhaps that realization changes the way you see the world forever. Because once you begin noticing the patterns, they become impossible to unsee. Humanity crossing forbidden boundaries again. Human identity destabilizing again. Technology advancing faster than wisdom again. Violence normalized again. Truth fragmented again. Spiritual confusions spreading everywhere again. Exactly the atmosphere ancient prophecy warned would return before the end. But my friends, This next realization may be the most terrifying of all. The people inside corrupt civilizations rarely recognize corruption while living inside it. Why? Because systems reshape perception gradually. And perhaps modern humanity increasingly lives inside systems designed to keep people distracted, emotionally exhausted, spiritually fragmented, and psychologically dependent simultaneously. Exactly the kind of environment where discernment becomes extraordinarily difficult. But my friends, there is one final detail hidden inside Noah's story that chills me more than anything else. The rain started suddenly, one moment normality, the next moment irreversible judgment. And perhaps modern civilization misunderstands prophecy completely because people expect obvious warning signs. Fire in the sky, monsters rising from oceans, instant catastrophe. But what if the real danger is subtler? A civilization transforming itself so completely that eventually it no longer remembers what humanity originally was. Exactly the transformation modern systems increasingly accelerate now. But my friends, another deeply unsettling possibility emerges from everything we uncovered tonight. What if the modern obsession with evolution beyond humanity is not progress at all, but regression disguised as advancement? Now think carefully. Human beings increasingly encouraged to merge with machines, redefine biology, escape mortality artificially, construct identity independently from nature itself. And perhaps all these ambitions share one hidden assumption, that humanity as originally created is insufficient. Exactly the same temptation offered in the beginning. You shall become more. But my friends, ancient corruption never began through force. It began through seduction, promises, enhancement, forbidden knowledge presented as liberation. And perhaps that same psychological pattern now surrounds modern civilization everywhere. Technology promising transcendence, artificial systems promising salvation, genetic engineering promising perfection, digital reality promising escape. Exactly the conditions ancient prophecy associates with humanity forgetting its dependence on God entirely. But my friends, the deeper we descend into the modern world, the more one terrifying realization emerges. Humanity increasingly seeks control over everything except itself. The skies, the genome, consciousness, climate, death. Yet people increasingly lack control over impulse, desire, attention, and emotion simultaneously. And perhaps civilizations collapsing spiritually always display that contradiction. Unlimited external power, minimal internal mastery. Exactly what ancient wisdom traditions warned destroys societies eventually. But my friends, this next realization becomes profoundly heavy. Modern civilization increasingly teaches people to fear being alone more than being corrupted. Silence avoided constantly, reflection avoided constantly. And perhaps people fear stillness because deep down they sense something fractured inside themselves already. Exactly why endless stimulation becomes addictive. Because distraction protects people temporarily from confronting spiritual emptiness honestly. But my friends, the final stage of corruption may not involve humanity becoming openly monstrous. It may involve humanity becoming spiritually hollow, smiling externally, empty internally, connected digitally, isolated emotionally, advanced technologically, lost spiritually. Exactly the atmosphere modern civilization increasingly reflects now. But my friends, another haunting detail hidden inside Noah's story changes everything once understood fully. The ark preserved life through separation from corruption. Now ask yourself honestly, what does separation even mean in a world where corruption enters through every screen, every algorithm, every digital system continuously? Perhaps it means preserving discernment, conscience, soul, truth, even when entire systems pressure humanity toward fragmentation constantly. And maybe that preservation becomes the modern ark itself. But my friends, another terrifying possibility still remains. What if the final deception succeeds precisely because it appears compassionate? Imagine a world exhausted by chaos, economic instability, psychological collapse, violence, loneliness, environmental fear. Now imagine systems emerging promising unity, peace, safety, and transcendence simultaneously. Would humanity resist or embrace it gratefully? That possibility should disturb every thinking person deeply, because prophecy repeatedly warns the final deception will seduce the world emotionally before dominating it politically. Exactly how civilizations surrender freedom historically. Not through chains first, through promises. But my friends, there is another chilling realization we cannot escape anymore. The modern world increasingly prepares humanity psychologically for replacing the sacred with the synthetic. Artificial intimacy replacing relationships, artificial wisdom replacing discernment, artificial consciousness replacing soul, artificial realities replacing truth. And perhaps once civilizations normalize the synthetic completely, they lose the ability to recognize authentic existence at all. Exactly the condition final deception requires. But my friends, the next part of this story may be the hardest truth yet. Noah likely looked insane to his generation, building an ark under clear skies, warning people who felt perfectly safe. Exactly how discernment appears inside spiritually blind civilizations. And perhaps modern humanity increasingly mocks caution for the same reason. Because civilizations intoxicated by pride cannot imagine until it begins already. But my friends, despite everything we uncovered tonight, the deepest warning may not be technological. It may be spiritual forgetfulness. Humanity forgetting truth, forgetting identity, forgetting God. And once civilizations forget what created them, they begin recreating themselves endlessly in distorted forms. Exactly what modern society increasingly attempts now. But my friends, perhaps this is why the words of Jesus echo so hauntingly across history, as it was in the days of Noah, not merely because catastrophe approached, but because humanity repeated the same spiritual rebellion again, pursuing power without wisdom, knowledge without truth, transformation without morality. Exactly the trajectory modern civilization increasingly follows now. But my friends, another terrifying question remains. If ancient corruption returned once already after the flood through Babel, empires, violence, and spiritual rebellion, what prevents it from fully returning again now through technology itself? Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, digital control systems, transhumanism, everything converging simultaneously for the first time in human history. And perhaps modern civilization mistakes this convergence for destiny, when prophecy may interpret it as warning instead. But my friends, there is one final truth I need you to carry with you after this journey ends tonight. The greatest danger facing humanity may not be machines, governments, technology, or even deception itself. It may be spiritual sleep, because sleeping civilizations do not resist corruption. They normalize it, celebrate it, defend it, exactly what the generation before the flood likely did too. And perhaps that is why vigilance matters now more than ever before. Not paranoia, awareness, discernment, the willingness to question what civilization increasingly calls normal. But my friends, as we stand here together at the edge of this unsettling possibility, one final image refuses to leave my mind. Noah standing at the ark while the sky remained clear. The world laughing, trading, building, celebrating. Completely unaware history was about to divide permanently between before and after. And perhaps modern humanity stands inside a similar moment now, without realizing it. Technology accelerating, truth dissolving, humanity redefining itself, ancient boundaries collapsing, everything moving faster and faster towards something enormous just beyond the horizon, something civilization senses subconsciously, but cannot fully name yet. And maybe that is why the world increasingly feels restless, anxious, unstable, as though reality itself trembles quietly beneath the surface. Because perhaps deep down humanity remembers, not consciously, but spiritually, the memory of another civilization that once believed itself untouchable, right before the flood came. My friends, if we truly are living in the days of Noah again, then the most important question is no longer whether prophecy is repeating. The real question is this: will humanity recognize the warning before the door closes again?